Hello, I am the Wizard of Tales, and I'm here to guide you today. I know this video is the perfect companion to help my dear dreamers relax and drift off to sleep. Before we dive into a world of calm and serenity, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, get cozy, take a deep breath, and let the magic of stories embrace you. Night fell heavily on the road that snaked between the hills of the interior of Sao Paulo. Miguel adjusted the rearview mirror, tried to improve visibility through the windshield, which had been battered by the torrential rain. The headlights of his '89 Chevette could barely cut through the darkness that grew thicker with every kilometer. As an app driver for 3 years, he was used to the nighttime weather, but this particular night had something different about it, a dense atmosphere that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The radio buzzed, alternating between static and fragmented snippets of old songs. Miguel tried to tune into a station, but gave up after a few unsuccessful attempts. The silence inside the car was broken only by the monotonous noise of the windshield wipers and the drumming of the rain on the metal roofs. His thoughts wandered between overdue bills and worrying about his sick mother, reasons that made him accept late-night races. Even in adverse weather conditions like that, he was returning from a run in a remote area when his eyes caught sight of a white figure on the side of the road. At first, he thought it was just a reflection of the rain in the headlights, but as he got closer, the silhouette became more defined. It was a young woman, dressed entirely in white, in a long, old-fashioned dress that seemed inappropriate for the storm. Her raised arm signaled for a ride. Miguel hesitated for a moment. His rational mind told him to keep going. After all, stopping for strangers on a deserted road in the middle of the night was a recipe for trouble. But something deep inside him compelled him to stop. Perhaps it was the girl's helpless expression, or perhaps the thought that it could be his own sister in that situation. He braked gently, pulling the car over onto the muddy shoulder. The young woman climbed into the back seat with an ethereal grace, her movements as silent as a breeze. Miguel noticed through the rearview mirror that she appeared to be around 20, with delicate features and very pale skin. Her long black hair was inexplicably dry, despite the torrential rain. "Good evening, ma'am. Where are you going?" Miguel asked, trying to maintain a professional tone, although a strange feeling was beginning to form in his stomach. The answer came in an almost inaudible whisper. "Rua das Margaritas, 237, Villa Santo Antonio." His voice had a distant quality, as if it came from very far away. Miguel knew the address. It was in an old district of the city, about 40 minutes away. He turned on the meter out of habit, although something told him that this would be no ordinary ride. The silence that followed was dense, almost palpable. He tried to strike up a conversation a few times, but the passenger would only respond with monosyllables when she answered at all. As he drove, Miguel began to notice disturbing details. The seat where the girl was sitting showed no sign of dampness, despite the torrential rain outside. Through the rearview mirror, his attempts to observe her were thwarted by a kind of mist that seemed to envelop her figure. The temperature inside the car had dropped considerably, to the point where her breath formed small clouds of condensation. The deserted streets of the city looked different that night, as if they had been transported to another era. The old houses of Villa Santo Antonio, with their Art Deco facades and manicured gardens, emanated a melancholy aura under the yellowish light of the street lamps. The rain had subsided to a fine, persistent drizzle. As he approached number 237, Miguel felt a shiver run down his spine. The house was an old but well-kept building with a front garden full of daisies, unusual for that time of year. A yellowish light shone through the lacy curtains in the living room, suggesting that someone was awake at that late hour. "We're here, ma'am," announced Miguel, turning to the back seat. The words died in his throat when he realized he was alone in the car. The seat was completely dry, with no sign that anyone had been there moments before. His heart raced, and a wave of icy dread ran through his body. With trembling hands, Miguel turned off the car and spent a few minutes trying to process what had happened. His rational mind searched for logical explanations, but nothing made sense. Driven by a curiosity that overcame his fear, he decided to knock on the door of the house. He needed to understand, he needed answers that would make sense of that surreal night. As he walked along the stone path in the garden, he noticed that the daisies seemed to glow supernaturally in the moonlight that was now breaking through the clouds. The sound of his footsteps on the wet gravel echoed eerily in the silence of the night. His hand hesitated for a moment before ringing the ancient bronze bell. The melodious sound of the bell reverberated through the house, and a few moments later, footsteps approached the door. Miguel felt his heart speed up even more when the door opened, revealing an elderly man with white hair and a tired but kind expression. Next to him, an equally elderly woman looked at him with curious and apprehensive eyes. At that moment, Miguel didn't know that he was about to discover a story that would change his life forever. A story of love, loss, and mysteries that transcended human understanding. What had begun as just another night at work would turn into a journey that would force him to question everything he believed about reality and the supernatural. "Good evening. Sorry to bother you so late," Miguel began, his voice betraying his nervousness. "I'm an app driver and, well, I just brought a young woman to this address, but his voice faltered, unsure of how to explain something he didn't even understand. The elderly couple exchanged a meaningful glance, as if those words were awakening long-held memories. The lady stepped forward, her eyes watering with sudden tears. "Please come in," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I think we need to talk." Miguel was led into a living room that seemed frozen in time. Old, well-preserved furniture, black and white photos on the walls, and a pendulum clock that ticked solemnly. The man, who introduced himself as Alberto, indicated an armchair for Miguel to sit in, while his wife, Dona Clara, went to prepare some tea. "How was she dressed?" asked Alberto, his voice carrying a weight that Miguel couldn't fully understand. "A long white dress. It looked old," Miguel replied, noticing how the gentleman's hands were trembling slightly. "She had long black hair and very pale skin." Dona Clara returned with a tray of tea, silent tears streaming down her wrinkled face. In her trembling hands, she held a picture frame which she handed to Miguel. The photograph showed exactly the same young woman who had been in his car moments before, smiling next to an old car, wearing the same white dress. "This was our daughter, Helena," said Dona Clara, taking a seat next to her husband. "She died exactly 40 years ago, on that same road where you found her today." Miguel felt a shiver run down his spine as the elderly people began to tell the story. Helena was a young teacher, adored by her students and known for her kindness. On that fateful night in 1983, she was returning from a graduation party for her students when her car broke down during a storm similar to the one that night. She tried to get help in the rain, Alberto continued, his voice breaking. "A truck. The driver said he didn't see her in time." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "Since then, especially on nights of heavy rain, we've had visitors like you. Drivers who find you in the same place, trying to get home." Miguel listened attentively, his cup of tea forgotten in his hands. The supernatural stories his grandmother used to tell him as a child seemed to take on a new dimension of reality. "But why does she keep coming back?" Mrs. Clara stood up and walked over to a bookcase, returning with a carved wind box. Inside were letters, photos, and a diary. "Helena was engaged," she explained, showing a photo of a smiling young man in military uniform. "Carlos left to serve abroad a week before the accident. She never received his last letter." The letter in question, yellowed by time but carefully preserved, was still unopened. Carlos never heard about Helena's accident. He himself died on duty a few weeks later. The double tragedy had devastated both families. "We believe she's still looking for a way home because there's something unfinished," said Alberto, looking thoughtfully at the photos. "Each person who brings her here is like an attempt to complete her last journey." Miguel noticed that his hands had stopped shaking. The initial fear had been replaced by a deep melancholy and compassion. His grandmother's stories about lost souls had taken on a new meaning. They weren't just tales to scare children, but reflections of real pain, of broken loves and goodbyes that never happened. The pendulum clock struck 3, making Michael realize how much time had passed. The rain outside had stopped completely, leaving only the silence of dawn. Donna Clara insisted on showing more photos of Helena, her training, her first days as a teacher, happy times with Carlos. "Have you tried opening the letter?" asked Miguel, looking at the sealed envelope on the table. "We didn't have the courage," replied Donna Clara. "We always felt it wasn't our right. It belongs to Helena." At that moment, a gentle breeze blew through the room, making the curtains dance slightly, even though all the windows were closed. The picture frame with Helena's photo trembled on the table, and for a moment, Miguel could have sworn he felt that same chill he had experienced in the car. "She's here," whispered Donna Clara, her hands clasping her husband's. "She always comes back when we talk about her." Miguel watched in fascination as the photos on the table moved slightly, as if someone invisible was watching them. The envelope of the unopened letter shook, sliding a few centimeters across the polished surface of the table. It was as if the very air in the room had become denser, charged with a presence that could not be seen, but could be felt by everyone present. The atmosphere in the old room became even denser when the letter began to move on its own. Miguel, Alberto, and Donna Clara watched in reverential silence as the envelope slowly slid across the table, stopping near the edge. Helena's invisible presence was almost tangible in the air. "Maybe," Miguel began hesitantly, "maybe it's time to open the letter." "If Helena is here," he didn't complete the sentence, but everyone understood the implicit meaning. Donna Clara looked at her husband, who nodded slightly. With trembling hands, she picked up the yellowed envelope. "Helena, my child," her voice was soft, motherly. "If you're here, give us a sign if we should open it." The curtains swung tighter, and one of the photos on the table fell, revealing a picture of Helena and Carlos together, smiling in front of the school where she taught. The signal seemed clear, taking extreme care not to damage the envelope that had been preserved for 4 decades. Donna Clara opened the letter. The paper was surprisingly well preserved, Carlos' firm handwriting still legible after all these years. Miguel noticed that his own hands were sweating as the lady began to read aloud. "My dear Helena, I hope this letter finds you well. The nights here are long and cold, but thinking of you warms my heart. I have news that I couldn't wait for. I got my transfer back. When this letter arrives, it will only be 2 weeks before we meet again. I can't stop thinking about our future together. The house we saw on Rua das Margaritas will be perfect. I can already imagine our children running around the garden while you grow your favorite flowers. I've saved every penny of my salary to put down the deposit. It will be our first great achievement together. The wedding ring I've chosen is with me, waiting for the moment to shine on your finger. I know we agreed to wait a little longer, but I can't put it off any longer. When I get back, I want us to get married right away. Life is too short to put off happiness. With all my love, Carlos." The silence that followed the reading was interrupted only by the muffled sound of Donna Clara's sobs. The temperature in the room dropped even more, and Miguel could see his own breath forming little clouds in the air. The photographs on the table began to shake more intensely. "The house," Alberto said suddenly, his voice choked. "This house, we bought it after the accident. It was their dream." Miguel looked around with new eyes, realizing that he was sitting in the house that should have been the young couple's happy home. The daisy garden outside, so well tended even after so many years, was a silent tribute to their lost daughter. A soft sound, like a distant sigh, echoed through the room. The curtains moved again, this time as if someone was walking through them. Miguel felt a presence pass through him, not a frightening chill, but a sense of deep melancholy. "She had to know," whispered Donna Clara, clutching the letter to her chest. "All these years, she kept coming back because she didn't know Carlos was coming back to her." Miguel remembered the young woman in her car, her silence in her distant expression. Now he understood. It wasn't just a lost soul trying to get home. It was a bride waiting for her love to return, trapped in an eternal cycle of waiting. The pendulum clock began to play a soft melody, an old lullaby that filled the room with its melancholy notes. Alberto explained in a choked voice that it was Helena's favorite song, and that the clock had never chimed since the day of the accident. "I think she's saying goodbye," said Alberto, hugging his wife. She's finally understood that Carlos is left too, that they can meet somewhere else. The photograph stopped shaking and the temperature gradually began to normalize. The presence that had once been so palpable faded away, leaving behind only a faint scent of daisies in the air. Miguel stayed with the couple until dawn, listening to stories about Helena and Carlos, about their dreams and interrupted plans. When the first rays of sunlight began to penetrate through the windows, he realized that he had witnessed something extraordinary. Not just an encounter with the supernatural, but a moment of resolution, of peace found after decades of waiting. Outside, the daisy garden glistened with the morning dew, each flower looking more alive and vibrant than before. Miguel was sure that Helena would never come back to hitchhike on rainy nights again. Her last journey was finally complete. In the days that followed that extraordinary night, Miguel couldn't stop thinking about Helena and her story. The encounter with the supernatural had changed something fundamental in his perspective on life and death. During his nightly runs, he often found himself looking through the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that ethereal figure in the white dress again. A week after the incident, Miguel decided to visit the house in Rua das Margaritas again. This time, he arrived during the day, carrying a small bouquet of fresh daisies. Dona Clara welcomed him with a warm smile, as if she had been expecting his return. The house looked different in the daylight, less mysterious, but still imbued with a peculiar serenity. Since that night, began Dona Clara as she served coffee in the same room where they had read the letter, things have changed around here. It's as if a weight has been lifted. She paused, looking thoughtfully out of the window at the garden. No other drivers have turned up reporting having found Helena. Miguel noticed that the old photographs were still on the table, but now they seemed to tell a different story. No longer one of sadness and waiting, but of love that transcended time. Alberto joined them, bringing a box of souvenirs that hadn't been shown the night before. "We found this yesterday," said Alberto, pulling out a notebook with a faded blue cover. "It's Helena's diary. We never had the courage to read it before, but now," his voice faltered for a moment. "Now it feels right." The diary revealed a Helena very different from the silent apparition Miguel had encountered. The pages were full of dreams, plans, and little everyday joys. She wrote about her students with affection, about Carlos' letters with youthful love, and about the future she imagined in that same house where they were now. "Look at this," said Dona Clara, pointing to a particular entry. It was written the day before the accident. Helena's delicate handwriting filled the page. "Tomorrow is my little one's graduation. After the party, I'm going to go to church and light a candle, asking for protection for Carlos. He's only a few days away. I can already feel my heart beating faster just thinking about it. The daisies in the garden of our future home look beautiful. I went there today. It would be the perfect place to start our life together." Miguel felt a lump in his throat. The young teacher had no idea that this would be her last day, that she would never achieve the dreams described in those pages. However, there was something beautiful and tragic about the fact that her spirit had chosen exactly that house, the symbol of her unfulfilled dreams, as the end point of her earthly journey. "We found this too," Alberto said, pulling out a different yellowed envelope from Carlos' letter. It was a letter that Helena had started writing to him, but never finished. The interrupted words in the middle of the page were a silent testimony to interrupted plans. "My love, I can't wait to tell you in person, but I can't keep this secret. I took a test today and..." The silence that followed was heavy. Mrs. Clara covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her face. Miguel understood the meaning of those unfinished words. Helena was pregnant when she died, taking with her not only her own dreams, but also a life that had barely begun. "She never told anyone," whispered Dona Clara, her voice embittered. "All these years, and we never knew." The daisy garden, visible through the window, seemed to shine with a different light in the afternoon sun. Miguel realized that those flowers weren't just a tribute to Helena's memory. They were a living testimony to dreams that, although interrupted, had never completely died. Alberto stood up slowly and walked over to an old record player in the corner of the room. Carefully, he put on a record and a soft melody filled the room. The same music that the pendulum clock had played that night. It was the song they danced when they got engaged, he explained. Helena said it would be the first song they danced to at their wedding. As the music played, Miguel noticed something extraordinary. The daisies in the garden seemed to move in a gentle dance, even though there was no wind. For a brief moment, he had the impression of seeing two translucent figures dancing among the flowers, one in a white dress and the other in military uniform. "Did you see?" he began, but stopped when he saw the serene smiles on the faces of the elderly couple. They had seen it too. It was no longer an apparition of sadness or farewell, but a glimpse of a love that had found its way into eternity. The days turned into weeks, and Miguel continued his regular visits to Helena's parents' house. Something inexplicable kept him connected to that story, to that family that fate had placed in his path. Afternoons spent with Alberto and Dona Clara became a comforting ritual, filled with stories of the past and a silent shared understanding of things that exist beyond our comprehension. On one of these visits, while helping Dona Clara organize old photographs, Miguel found something interesting at the bottom of a dusty box, an old newspaper scrapbook. The yellowed headlines told not only about Helena's accident, but also about other similar stories over the years. Drivers reporting encounters with a mysterious woman in white on the same road. "There were so many," said Dona Clara, running her fingers gently over the clippings. "Each one brought a little piece of her back home. But you, Miguel, were different. You helped our daughter find peace." Miguel reflected on how that rainy night had changed his life. His night runs now carried a new meaning. Each passenger could have their own story, their own pain and undisclosed secrets. He had become more attentive, more compassionate, as if Helena had taught him a silent lesson about empathy and human connection. Alberto, who was tending the garden, entered the room with some freshly picked daisies. "You know," he began, placing the flowers in a vase. "Since that night, the daisies have never wilted. It's as if they're always in full bloom, no matter the season." The phenomenon of the eternally blooming daisies became a bit of a local mystery. Neighbors began to notice, and soon the story of the house on Rua das Daisadas began to circulate around town. Not as a horror story about a ghost bride, but as a love story that transcended death itself. Miguel decided to do something special. With the help of other app drivers, he organized a small celebration in memory of Helena and Carlos. On a clear night with a full moon, exactly 1 month after their supernatural encounter, a group of people gathered in the garden of the house. Among them were Helena's former pupils, now elderly, who still had fond memories of their young teacher. Mrs. Clara brought Helena's diary and read some passages aloud. The young teacher's words, full of hope and love, echoed through the garden lit by small lanterns. Alberto shared stories about how Helena and Carlos met, about their plans for the future, about the love that not even death could erase. During the impromptu ceremony, something extraordinary happened. The music playing on the old record player, the same one Helena and Carlos danced to at their engagement, began to sound clearer, more alive. The daisies in the garden seemed to pulsate with a light of their own, and a gentle breeze carried an intense scent of flowers. Everyone present felt it. It was no longer a melancholy or frightening presence, but something welcoming, like a warm farewell hug. Some swore they saw, for a brief moment, the reflection of a young couple dancing among the flowers, their translucent figures shining in the moonlight. Miguel watched as one of Helena's former students approached Dona Clara with an old box. "I found this among my mother's things," she said, moved. Inside was a photograph that nobody knew about. Helena smiling in front of her classroom, one hand discreetly resting on her belly, her secret kept in a radiant smile. The discovery of this last photograph brought a feeling of completeness. The circle was closing, not with sadness, but with acceptance and understanding. Helena and Carlos' story, although tragic, had touched and transformed countless lives over the decades. In the months that followed, Miguel continued his work as a driver, but something had fundamentally changed in his outlook. Every passenger who got into his car was a potential story. Every night wrought a possibility for meaningful encounters. The experience with Helena taught him that some connections transcend time and death itself. Alberto and Dona Clara transformed the house into a small memorial. One of the rooms was dedicated to telling the story of Helena and Carlos, with photographs, letters, and a carefully preserved diary. The Daisy Garden became a place of reflection and hope where people came to find comfort and, occasionally, to share their own stories of love and loss. One quiet afternoon, while Miguel was helping to organize the memorial, Dona Clara handed him something special, the old wedding ring that Carlos had never had the chance to give Helena. "We want you to have this," she said softly. "You've become part of this story, part of our family." Miguel accepted the ring with reverence, understanding that it wasn't just an object, but a symbol of a story that would live on through the people who knew and shared it. The road where it all began was no longer a place of tragedy, but a meeting point between two worlds, where love proved stronger than death itself. The daisies continue to bloom eternally in the garden of House 237, and on full moon nights, passers-by can sometimes hear a soft melody, the music of two hearts that have finally found their way to each other, dancing eternally among the flowers that never wither. The icy wind blew across the snowy plains of Midgard, carrying with it the ancient whispers of the stories the elders told about the magnificent bridge that connected the world of men to the golden realm of the gods. Astrid, a young warrior with hair as red as fire and eyes as green as the aurora borealis, watched the horizon with a crystalline glow of the Bifrost cut through the sky. Ever since she was a little girl, Astrid grew up listening to stories about Heimdall, the divine guardian who stood vigilant at his golden post, his eyes able to see every leaf that moved in the 9 worlds and his ears so sharp that they could hear the wool growing on the sheep. Stories had always fascinated her, but never as much as at that moment, when her small village was facing a threat that seemed beyond mortal comprehension. Mysterious shadows had begun to materialize at the edge of the nearby forest, creatures that didn't belong in Midgard, and that brought with them a cold unlike normal winter, a cold that froze the very soul. The elders whispered that they were harbingers of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, but Astrid refused to accept that the end was near without at least trying to do something about it. It was during one particularly dark night that she met Eric, a mysterious traveler who arrived in the village carrying with him an unusual knowledge of the ancient runes and the secret paths between the worlds. His golden eyes seemed to hold ancient secrets, and his presence caused a mixture of fascination and distrust among the locals. "The ancient barriers between the worlds are crumbling," Eric explained during a meeting in the communal hall, his deep voice echoing off the wooden walls as the fire crackled in the central fireplace. "What you've been seeing are just the first signs of something much bigger approaching." Astrid realized that Eric was no simple traveler when she saw him trace runes in the air that glowed momentarily before dissolving like mist. There was something divine about his presence, something she couldn't explain, but which resonated with the stories her grandmother used to tell about the Aesir, the gods who inhabited Asgard. The shadows began to grow bolder, venturing closer and closer to the houses at night. Children disappeared, cattle were found frozen in the fields, and a blanket of fear began to cover the village like an icy shroud. That's when Eric revealed his true purpose there. "There is a way to stop this," he told Astrid privately, as they both watched the aurora borealis dance across the night sky, its colors reflecting similarly to those of Bifrost. "But it will require a journey to Asgard, and I can't do it alone." The revelation that Eric was actually an emissary of Odin, sent to find a mortal worthy of crossing the Bifrost, struck Astrid like a bolt from the blue. The ancient prophecy spoke of a time when the worlds would need to unite to avoid their premature destruction before the appointed time for Ragnarok. "Why me?" asked Astrid, her heart pounding at the prospect of walking across the rainbow bridge, of seeing the golden realm of the gods with her own eyes. "Because you still believe," replied Eric simply. "When everyone else lost faith, you kept the flame of the old stories alive in your heart. What's more, you carry in your veins the blood of the ancient seers, those who could see through the veils between the worlds." The revelation about her own lineage surprised Astrid. but it explained the strange dreams she had always had, the occasional visions that had haunted her since childhood. Her grandmother, before leaving for Odin's Hole, had told her that one day she would understand her true purpose. While Eric explained the dangers of the journey that awaited them, Astrid watched the horizon where the bifrost occasionally flickered. Crossing the bridge would not simply be a matter of walking over it. The structure itself was alive in its own way, responding only to those who are worthy and burning anyone else who dared to attempt the crossing without permission. Heimdall is watching us right now, said Eric, his golden eyes reflecting the northern lights. He knows we've come and why we are here, but even with his approval, the journey will not be easy. There are ancient forces that do not wish mortals to reach Asgard, even if it is to prevent a catastrophe. The shadows in the forest seemed to grow thicker with these words, as if responding to the mention of their existence. Astrid felt the weight of responsibility fall on her shoulders. It wasn't just her village that was in danger, but the entire fabric that held the 9 worlds in balance. "When do we leave?" she asked, her determination growing with each passing moment. "At dawn," Eric replied, "when the first rays of sunlight touched the bifrost, turning it into a path of liquid fire across the heavens. It will be our best chance of making the crossing without being noticed by those who want to stop us." That night, while the village slept, Astrid prepared for the journey that would change not only her life, but potentially the fate of all 9 worlds. In her room, she packed only the essentials, some provisions, a small dagger she had inherited from her grandmother, and an amulet with ancient runes that she had always carried with her. The weight of what was to come kept her awake, her thoughts turning to all the stories she had heard about Asgard, about the gods, and their eternal battles against the forces of chaos. Now she would be part of those stories, for better or worse. Before the first ray of sunlight touched the horizon, Astrid was already on her feet, adjusting the small leather bag on her back. Eric was waiting for her at the edge of the village, his tall, imposing silhouette outlined against the still, starry sky. The air was colder than usual, and a thick mist covered the ground like a ghostly carpet. "The shadows are restless," Eric murmured, his golden eyes scanning the darkness of the forest. "They know what we intend to do." Astrid followed his gaze and noticed subtle movements among the trees, as if the darkness itself were alive and aware. They began their journey in silence, following an ancient path that few still knew. Eric explained that it was one of the ancient routes used by pilgrims who, in ancient times, sought the blessing of the gods. As they advanced, Astrid noticed that the stones along the path were marked with runes worn away by time. "Each rune is a prayer," explained Eric, touching one of the markings with reverence. "And also a warning. Not everyone who has attempted this journey has survived to tell the tale." His words made Astrid shudder, but they didn't diminish her determination. The sun was just beginning to rise when they reached a circular clearing, perfectly formed as if it had been designed by divine hands. In the center, a circle of ancient stones formed an intricate pattern that Astrid recognized from her grandmother's stories. It was an anchor point, a place where the bifrost occasionally touched Midgard. Eric began to trace runes in the air, this time with more complexity than Astrid had ever seen before. Each symbol glowed with its own light before connecting to the others, forming a web of golden energy that hung over their heads. The air began to vibrate with an ancient and powerful energy. "When the bifrost descends," Eric instructed, his voice taking on a more formal tone, "you will only have a few moments to cross. The bridge will recognize your ancient blood, but it will still be dangerous. Don't look down, don't stop walking, and above all, don't doubt." The first ray of sun broke through the horizon, and with it came a spectacle that Astrid would never forget. The bifrost descended from the sky like a cascade of colors, its sparkling crystals reflecting every color imaginable, and some she didn't even know existed. The impact of the bridge touching the stone circle made the ground tremble beneath their feet. But they weren't alone. The shadows of the forest condensed, taking on more defined shades. Ancient, malevolent creatures that moved like black smoke towards them. Eric drew a sword that glowed with a light of its own, positioning himself between Astrid and the creatures. "Run," he shouted, his voice thundering with divine power. "I'll keep them busy. You need to get to Asgard." Astrid hesitated only for a moment before starting her run towards the bridge. Her feet touched the crystals of the Bifrost, and she immediately felt the ancient power flowing through her. It was like walking on solidified light, each step sending ripples of energy through the structure. The wind held around her, carrying echoes of ancient voices and fragments of long-forgotten stories. Through the storm of colors and sounds, she could hear the sounds of battle below, Eric facing the dark creatures with his gleaming sword. As she climbed, Midgard fell behind, and Astrid found herself crossing the stars themselves. The cold of the space between the worlds was unlike anything she had ever experienced, but the ancient blood in her veins protected her, keeping her warm and aware. Suddenly, one of the dark creatures managed to escape from Eric and started climbing up the Bifrost after her. Astrid could feel its evil presence approaching, the unnatural cold emanating from the creature, threatening to freeze her footsteps. She remembered Eric's words, "Don't stop, don't doubt." Instinctively, she touched the amulet around her neck, and the ancient runes engraved on it began to glow. A wave of heat spread through her body, and she heard a cry of pain behind her. The Bifrost crystals had responded to her presence, burning the creature from the shadows that had dared to pursue her. In front of her, through the veil of rainbow colors, Astrid began to glimpse something that made her heart stop for a moment. The golden gates of Asgard, shining with a light that was not of this world. In there, an imposing figure awaited her arrival. Heimdall, the Guardian, his golden armor reflecting the colors of the Bifrost. The air became thinner, and each step required more effort. Astrid could feel the weight of the distance between the worlds, reality itself distorting around her. But she pressed on, driven by the urgency of her mission and the knowledge that Eric was still fighting below to ensure her passage. The voices on the wind became clearer. They were the whispers of the gods, watching her journey, judging her courage and determination. Astrid kept her eyes fixed on the goal, even as tempting visions and unimaginable terrors danced in the periphery of her vision, trying to distract her from the path. Finally, with one last effort, Astrid reached the golden platform where Heimdall was waiting. The Guardian of the Worlds was even more impressive than the stories described, tall as a mountain. His golden skin reflected the light of Asgard's suns, and his eyes contained the knowledge of ages. "Welcome, daughter of Midgard." His voice rang out like distant thunder. "We have long awaited your arrival." Heimdall turned his omniscient gaze to the Bifrost, where Eric could still be seen fighting against the shadows. With a flick of his golden sword, a wave of light descended across the bridge, scattering the creatures of darkness. Eric emerged moments later, his form changing subtly as he ascended, his mortal disguise shedding to reveal Tyr, the god of justice and war. Astrid felt her heart skip a beat as she realized that she had been traveling all this time in the company of a deity. "The shadows are becoming bolder," observed Tyr, joining them on the platform. "They've never tried to follow someone through Bifrost before." His golden gaze met Astrid's. "You proved your worth on the crossing, young seer." Heimdall gestured, and a portal opened before them, revealing a path that led to the heart of Asgard. Astrid could barely take in the magnificence of what she saw. Palaces of gold and crystal floated among amber clouds, connected by bridges of light. Trees with silver leaves swayed in a wind that carried ancient melodies, and in the sky, unknown constellations danced in hypnotic patterns. "The father of all awaits in Valhalla," announced Heimdall. "He wishes to hear personally about the shadows that threaten Midgard." Astrid felt the weight of responsibility grow on her shoulders. She was about to meet Odin, the most powerful of the gods. As they walked through the streets of Asgard, Einarjar warriors bowed their heads in respect to Tyr and looked curiously at the mortal woman who accompanied them. Valkyries flew overhead on their winged horses, their silver armor glittering in the eternally golden light of the divine realm. "The shadows that have plagued your village," Tyr explained as they advanced, "are fragments of something much older and more dangerous. something that should remain dormant until the real Ragnarok. His expression turned grim. Someone is trying to awaken forces that should remain sealed. Astrid absorbed every detail around her, from the runes that pulsed on the walls of the buildings to the ravens of Odin that occasionally crossed the sky. "Why now?" she asked. "Why choose our village?" "Your village holds ancient secrets," replied Tyr. "Its very existence is no coincidence. The seers of your lineage were appointed as guardians long ago, even if they have forgotten their purpose. They approached Valhalla, a palace so vast that it seemed to touch the stars themselves. Its doors, made of interlaced golden shields, opened silently at their approach. Inside, the hall seemed to stretch on endlessly, with thousands of tables where fallen warriors feasted eternally. The path took them to Odin's throne, where the father of all was waiting. His one eye shone with ancient wisdom, and two ravens, Hugin and Munin, perched on his shoulders. At his side was Frigg, his wife, whose gentle gaze somewhat reassured Astrid's nervousness. The daughter of the seers returns to Asgard. Odin's voice filled the hall. After so many generations, the ancient blood awakens again. He stood up, his cloak of stars floating around him. "But time is cruel to us. The shadows you saw are only the beginning." Frigg approached Astrid, gently touching her face. "Your grandmother served the gods well, child. She knew this day would come and prepared for it in the only way she could, by keeping the old stories alive." "What's really going on?" Astrid found the courage to ask. "Why are the barriers between the worlds weakening?" Odin made a gesture, and the air between them turned into a web of images. The 9 worlds connected by Yggdrasil, the world tree. "Something is eating away at the roots of reality itself," he explained. "An ancient curse, sealed millennia ago, is being awakened before its time." "Loki," whispered Tyr, and the name seemed to make the flames of the torches tremble. "Yes," confirmed Odin. "Even in his chains, he has found a way to spread his chaos. His agents work in the shadows, weakening the seals that maintain the order of the worlds." Frigg took Astrid's hands between his. "That's why you were brought here. The blood of the seers carries an ancient magic capable of strengthening the barriers between worlds. But to fully awaken this power, you will need to undertake a dangerous journey. A journey into the nether realms," Odin added, his eyes shining brightly. "To find the source of the corruption and seal it away again, before it's too late." Astrid felt the weight of fate on her shoulders, but also a growing determination. Her grandmother's stories, the vision she'd always had, her natural instinct to protect, it all made sense now. She was part of something bigger, a crucial piece in a battle that spanned the ages. "What do I need to do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. Odin rose from his throne and walked over to an ancient tapestry that covered one of Valhalla's walls. With a gesture, the woven images came to life, revealing a deep cavern in the far reaches of Niflheim, the realm of darkness and eternal mist. "The source of corruption is there," he explained, "where the deepest roots of Yggdrasil touch the primordial void. Loki has found a way to poison these roots through his agents, but only someone with the blood of the seers can reach this place without succumbing to the madness that permeates those depths." Frigg led Astrid to a side altar, where 3 objects rested: a dagger with runes engraved on its blade, a vial containing a liquid that glowed like liquid stars, and a necklace with a crystal that seemed to contain an aurora borealis inside. "These are sacred tools," said the goddess, "forged at the dawn of time for moments like this. The dagger can cut through the veils between worlds. The elixir will keep your essence intact in the depths, and the necklace," she paused meaningfully, "the necklace contains a spark of Bifrost itself, capable of illuminating even the deepest darkness." Tyr approached, his presence emanating strength and determination. "I will accompany you to the gates of Niflheim, but beyond that point, you must go alone. The ancient laws are clear. Only the blood of seers can directly interfere with the roots of the world tree." As Astrid absorbed all this information, a sudden tremor shook the hall. Through the windows of Valhalla, she saw strange ripples running through the fabric of reality, as if the very air was shattering. Time is running out, Odin declared gravely. The shadows are growing stronger. If the roots of Yggdrasil are completely corrupted, the 9 worlds will begin to disintegrate. Heimdall, who had remained silent until then, spoke. The barriers between the worlds are thinner than they have ever been. I can see the shadows moving even in the most sacred corners of Asgard. Astrid took the 3 sacred objects, feeling the ancient power that emanated from them. The necklace, when it touched her skin, emitted a soft glow that seemed to resonate with something in her own blood. The dagger had a comforting weight in his hand, and the flask emanated a gentle warmth. How will I know what to do when I get there? She asked, the reality of her mission beginning to weigh on her shoulders. Your blood will know, Frigg replied softly. Seers have always carried the necessary knowledge in their own souls. When the time comes, you will understand. Odin made a gesture, and part of the hole transformed, revealing a dark portal that seemed to suck in the very light around it. This is the way to Niflheim, he explained. Through it, you and Tyr will be able to travel quickly to the limits of that dark realm. Before they could leave, Frigg took Astrid's hands once more. There is something else you should know, said the goddess, her voice laden with concern. In the depths of Niflheim, you will find more than shadows and corruption. You will find truths about your own lineage, about the true purpose of the seers. Be prepared to face these revelations. Astrid nodded, sensing that there was much more to the goddess' words than she was revealing. Tyr placed a hand on her shoulder, signaling that it was time to leave. One last thing, said Odin, his eyes shining brightly. In the depths, you will hear voices. You will see tempting or terrifying visions. Remember, not everything your eyes see or your ears hear is real. Trust your blood, the ancestral knowledge that runs through your veins. With these words of warning echoing in her mind, Astrid followed Tyr towards the portal. Darkness immediately enveloped them, and she felt as if she were falling through an endless abyss. The necklace around her neck glowed brighter, creating a protective bubble of light around her. The journey through the portal was like sailing through an ocean of shadows. Occasionally, Astrid glimpsed fragments of other worlds through cracks in reality. The fiery forges of Muspelheim, the icy holes of Jotunheim, the mysterious depths of Svartalfheim. Each vision lasted only an instant before being swallowed up again by darkness. Tyr stayed close, his divine presence serving as an anchor in the storm of chaos that surrounded them. Keep your focus, he instructed. Niflheim will try to confuse your senses from the moment we arrive. It's a realm of illusions and eternal mist. As they advanced, Astrid began to feel a change in the air around them. The cold became more intense, more penetrating, and the darkness began to give way to a thick, gray mist. They were approaching their destination. The portal opened onto a desolate plain covered in a perpetual mist that snaked around them as if it had a life of its own. The ground beneath their feet was a mixture of ice and black rock, and the air carried indistinct whispers that seemed to come from every direction. Here we part, said Tyr, his imposing figure contrasting with the bleak landscape. Follow the call of your blood. It will guide you to the corrupted roots. His golden eyes met Astrid's one last time before he disappeared into the mist. Alone in Niflheim, Astrid felt the full weight of her mission. The necklace around her neck pulsed gently, its light creating a faint path through the darkness. She began to walk, using the sacred dagger to cut through the webs of mist that tried to surround her. Odin's words echoed in her mind as she advanced. Not everything she would see or hear would be real. This warning proved vital when the first illusions began to manifest. He saw his village in flames, heard the cries of its inhabitants, but the pulse of ancient blood in his veins showed him the truth behind the visions. The terrain began to descend, taking her deeper and deeper into the realm of shadows. The walls of the cave that appeared in front of her were covered in ancient runes that glowed faintly, as if responding to her presence. Some she recognized from her grandmother's stories. Others seemed older than language itself. As she descended, the roots of Yggdrasil began to appear, running through the rocky walls like gigantic veins. But something was wrong. Dark spots spread across them like a disease, and a black, viscous liquid dripped from their wounds. It was then that the voices began, no longer indistinct whispers, but clear words that promised power, knowledge, the ability to change the fate of the 9 worlds. Astrid recognized this as another attempt to confuse her and reach for the vial of star elixir, taking a small sip that instantly cleared her mind. In the heart of the cave, she found what she was looking for, a nexus where several of Yggdrasil's main roots met. At the center of this confluence, a shadowy figure worked, his hands emanating an evil energy that seeped into the roots. It was one of Loki's agents, a creature who had once been a dark elf before giving himself over to corruption. "I was expecting you, daughter of the seers," the creature spoke, its voice a mixture of several different voices. "Have you come to try and stop the inevitable?" Astrid held up the sacred dagger, its glow intensifying in the presence of the darkness. "It's not inevitable," she replied. "Ragnarok has its own time, and it's not now." The creature laughed, a sound that made the very roots tremble. "Your lineage was always so presumptuous, thinking they could maintain the natural order of things. But do you know why you were really chosen? Why did the gods entrust this power to mortals?" Before Astrid could react, visions flooded her mind. She saw the first seers, saw how they were created not just to protect, but to serve as living anchors, keeping reality stable through their own suffering. He saw his grandmother, carrying the weight of this knowledge in silence until the end. "They made you slaves," the creature continued, living chains to maintain their precious order. But something in the visions caught Astrid's attention. It wasn't slavery she saw, but a choice. The first seers had accepted their role voluntarily, understanding the importance of balance between the worlds. Her grandmother didn't carry a burden, but a purpose. The ancestral knowledge in her blood awoke fully, and Astrid finally understood what she needed to do. She lifted the necklace containing the Bivra spark, its glow intensifying until it was almost blinding. The sacred light of the rainbow bridge was anathema to the shadows, and the creature recoiled with a cry of pain. Taking advantage of this moment, Astrid began to sing, not an ordinary song, but an ancient chant that arose naturally from her ancestral memories. The runes on her dagger responded, glowing in sync with her singing, and she began to trace symbols in the air that materialized in pure light. The creature tried to stop her, casting shadows that were dispersed by the glow of the necklace. Yggdrasil's roots began to pulse with new energy, responding to the power of the seer's blood. The corruption began to recede, burned away by the sacred light emanating from the symbols that Astrid continued to trace. With one fluid movement, she drove the dagger into the center of the nexus of roots, completing the circle of runes. A wave of energy exploded from the point of impact, purifying the roots and dispelling the shadows. The creature let out one last scream before collapsing in a black mist. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft pulsing of the now healed roots. Astrid felt the ancient power ebb away, leaving her exhausted but satisfied. She had fulfilled her purpose, not as a slave of the gods, but as a guardian by choice. The path back to the surface seemed shorter, as if Niflheim itself recognized her victory and helped her on her journey. Tyr was waiting for her where they had parted, a smile of approval on his divine face. "The barriers between the worlds are already beginning to strengthen," he said. "Not only have you prevented corruption, but you have also fully awakened the power of your bloodline." When they returned to Asgard, Astrid was greeted like a true hero. Odin and Frigg were waiting for her in Valhalla, along with Heimdall and the other gods. But her thoughts were already in her village, with the people who needed her protection. "Your place is in Midgard," said Frigg gently, noticing her thoughts. "But now you fully understand your role as guardian." Astrid nodded, feeling at peace with her destiny. She returned to her village not just as an awakened seer, but as a living bridge between the worlds, ready to maintain the balance and protect the ancient stories that she now knew were much more than just tales. The shadows had retreated, but she knew that other threats would come, and when they did, she would be ready, carrying with her the knowledge of the ancients and the strength of her own choice to be a guardian of the 9 worlds. In the beginning, there was only the vast ocean plunged into infinite darkness. The black waters stretched as far as the eye could see, and the silence was broken only by the gentle movement of the waves that danced eternally without destination. In this primordial setting, a single being stood out, the raven, a majestic creature with black feathers that reflected what little light there was in the void. This was no ordinary crow. Its eyes shone with ancient wisdom, and its wings carried the power of creation itself. Kokoro, as it was known in ancient languages, had emerged from the shadows themselves, born from a thought of the universe. His solitude was his only companion as he flew over the infinite ocean, observing his own reflection in the dark waters. For eons that could not be measured, Kokoro flew without rest, this curious mind constantly searching for something beyond the monotony of darkness. In her heart, a burning desire for change grew, then inexplicable will to transform that emptiness into something more. It was then, in a moment of deep contemplation, that he realized he was not alone in his journey. From the depths of the ocean, an ancient voice emerged, as old as time itself. It was Namaka, the spirit of the primordial waters, who had long been watching Raven in his solitary flight. His presence was manifested through gentle ripples on the surface of the sea, forming patterns that only Kokoro could interpret. "Why do you fly aimlessly, Shadow Architect?" asked Namaka, his voice echoing across the waters. "What are you looking for in this infinite void?" Kokoro landed on a wave that hung suspended, like a liquid throne created especially for him. "I seek purpose," he replied, his words carrying the weight of 1,000 thoughts. "This world is too vast to remain in the shadows." It was at this moment that Kokoro discovered his true nature. In his wings slept the power to turn dreams into reality. In his beak he carried the ability to shape the shapeless. And in his heart, he held the desire to create something extraordinary. On the endless horizon, Kokoro saw something that no one else could see. 3 small points of light, so distant that they seemed like an illusion. They were the celestial boxes, mystical containers that held the secrets of luminosity. Raven knew, either by instinct or fate, that these objects held the key to transforming that world of darkness. Namaka, sensing Kokoro's thoughts, became restless. "The heavenly boxes are sacred," she warned, her waters shimmering with concern. "They were sealed by the ancients, those who came before us. Disturbing them could bring consequences that even I cannot foresee." But Kokoro had already made up his mind. With a determined flap of his wings, he launched himself towards the heavenly boxes. His journey would not be easy. The shadows themselves seemed to want to keep him away, creating air currents that tried to divert his course. The wind howled with ancient voices, warning of the dangers of his endeavor. As he flew, Kokoro began to understand that it wasn't just the darkness that needed to be transformed. It was the very fabric of reality that was crying out for change. In his flight, he could feel the weight of responsibility on his wings. He was not just a creator, but a guardian of what was to come. The waters beneath him began to churn more strongly, as if the ocean itself was responding to his determination. Namaka, although worried, couldn't help but admire Raven's courage. She knew that this moment would mark the beginning of a new era, for better or worse. As she approached the heavenly boxes, Kokoro could feel the ancient energy emanating from them. Each one pulsed with a different kind of light. One was golden like the brightest sun, another silver like the most delicate moonlight, and the third sparkled with thousands of tiny points of light, like the stars that were yet to be born. The challenge before him was monumental. The boxes were protected by mystical seals, created to resist the passage of time in attempts to tamper with them. But Kokoro was no ordinary being. In his essence, he carried the very force of creation, a gift that even he didn't fully understand. Namaka watched everything with growing apprehension. The waters under her domain moved in increasingly complex patterns, reflecting her restlessness. She knew that the balance of the void was about to be altered forever, and the consequences of this change would be irreversible. With a precise movement, Kokoro reached the first box. His bright eyes studied the intricate patterns that sealed it, trying to understand its secrets. He knew that his every action from that moment on would shape not only the physical world, but also the fate of all beings yet to come. The first seal began to crack under his touch, releasing a thin beam of golden light that cut through the darkness like a sharp blade. It was only the beginning of a transformation that would change the face of that primordial universe forever. Kokoro, the architect of shadows, was about to take the first step on his journey of creation, a journey that would lead him to shape mountains, bring forests to life, and populate the world with beings of all shapes and sizes. The wind whispered ancient prophecies, and the waters danced with renewed energy. The moment of creation had arrived, and with it, the dawn of a new era was about to awaken in the hands, or rather, the wings of the most unlikely of creators, a raven who dared to defy the darkness. The beam of golden light that escaped from the first celestial box grew with every moment, like a primordial dawn that had never been witnessed before. Kokoro kept his beak firmly attached to the seal, his black feathers now bathed in the radiant glow emanating from the box. The power contained therein was greater than he had imagined, and for a brief moment, he felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of his own daring. Namaka watched in fascination and awe as the waters around him began to reflect that strange new light, creating dancing patterns on their surface that had never existed before. "Are you sure you're ready for the consequences of your actions, Kokoro?" His voice echoed across the waves, carrying both concern and reverence. Raven didn't answer immediately, concentrating on his task. With a precise and determined movement, he finally managed to completely break the first seal. The golden box opened in a spectacle of light and heat, releasing the sun in all its primordial glory. The incandescent sphere rose slowly over the dark horizon, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange for the first time. The heat of the newborn sun warmed Kokoro's wings, and he felt a deep satisfaction at seeing his first act of creation manifest itself so majestically. The waters below began to glow with golden reflections, creating a spectacle never before seen in that primordial world. Without wasting any time, Raven turned his attention to the second box, the one that held the moon. The seal on this one was different, more subtle and delicate, as if it had been woven with silver threads. Kokoro realized that he would need a gentler approach this time. Using the tip of his ward, he began to carefully unravel the mystical patterns that held the box shut. As he worked, he noticed that the sun was beginning to establish its first cycle, moving slowly across the newly formed sky. It was crucial that he release the moon before the first night arrived, to maintain the delicate balance that was beginning to form. "The tides respond to your creation," observed Namaka, his waters moving in new rhythms, attracted by the gravitational pull of the sun. "The world is changing, Kokoro, and there's no turning back." Raven knew she was right. His every action was creating new natural laws, establishing patterns that would last for eternity. With even more determination, he focused on the seal of the second box. Its silver feathers glowed with a light of their own now, as if they were absorbing the essence of the moon that was still trapped there. Finally, the second seal gave way, and the silver box opened with a soft sigh. The moon emerged, a pale, serene sphere that began its ascent into the darkening sky. Its soft light created a perfect contrast with the intense brightness of the sun that was now setting for the first time. Kokoro watched in amazement as his first two creations established a celestial dance, a cosmic ballet that would mark the rhythm of life for all the ages to come. Day and night were born at that moment, bringing with them concepts that hadn't existed before. Time, cycles, change. Only the third box remained, the one containing the stars. This one was different from the others, its surface sparkling with thousands of tiny points of light, as if it could no longer contain the energy it held inside. The seal on this last box was the most complex of the three, an intricate web of energy that seemed to change shape every time Kokoro looked at it. Namaka noticed Raven's hesitation at this latest challenge. "The stars are different," she warned, their waters reflecting the combined brilliance of the sun and moon. "They carry not only light, but also dreams and destinies. They are the weavers of stories yet to come." Kokoro understood that this last release would be the most significant. The stars would not just be points of light in the sky. They would be beacons of hope, guides for travelers, inspiration for the dreamers who would one day inhabit the world he was creating. With a delicacy that contrasted with his imposing form, the raven began to work on the last seal. His wings moved with surgical precision, undoing the mystical knots one by one. The process was slow and required all his concentration, as one false move could result in cosmic chaos. As the seal came undone, tiny points of light began to escape, like little sighs of eternity. Each star that broke free found its place in the vast night sky, gradually forming the constellations that would tell the stories of the universe. Kokoro's work was almost complete, but he knew that this was only the beginning of his journey as a creator. Light had been brought into the world, but there was still much to be done. The infinite waters begged for land, the vast empty expanses cried out for life, and the primordial silence longed for voices to fill it. The last star found its place in the firmament, completing the great work of illuminating the world. Kokoro hovered for a moment, his wings outstretched, admiring the transformation he had accomplished. The universe now pulsed with a new and vibrant energy, a rhythm that he himself had established. Namaka moved his waters in a pattern that suggested approval. "You have brought light into the world, architect," she said, her voice carrying a new tone of respect. "But the darkness still has its place in its purpose. The balance you have created is perfect." Raven knew she was right. The darkness had not been eliminated, but transformed into something just as precious. The night, with its silver moon and twinkling stars, was just as important as the sunny day. It was in this balance that the true beauty of his creation lay. While resting on a gentle wave, Kokoro was already beginning to plan his next great work. His keen eyes focused on the depths of the ocean, where he knew he would find the necessary elements for his next creation. The mainland was waiting to emerge, and with it, a new chapter in the history of the world was about to begin. With his gaze fixed on the depths of the ocean, Kokoro began his descent into the dark waters. Her wings, still shimmering with the reflection of the celestial lights she had released, cut through the air in precise movements. The world was different now, no longer plunged in perpetual darkness, but in a harmonious cycle of light and shadow. Namaka sensed the approach of the raven, and its waters opened gently, like a silent invitation. "The depths hold ancient secrets," she whispered across the waves. "What do you seek in the bowels of the ocean, creator?" Kokoro dipped her wings into the warm waters, feeling the primal energy that pulsed in the underwater currents. "I seek the substance from which the earth will be born," he replied, his voice reverberating through the waters. "This world needs more than just sky and sea." The raven's dive was deep and determined. As he descended, the waters became denser and colder. The light he had brought to the world barely penetrated these depths, creating a realm of shadows reminiscent of the beginning of time. But now, these shadows were no longer an endless void. They were a mystery to be explored. At the bottom of the ocean, Kokoro found what he was looking for: a dense, dark mass, a mixture of sand, rocks, and minerals that had lain dormant since the beginning of time. With his powerful beak, he began to work this primordial matter, shaping it with the same precision he had used to release the celestial lights. Namaka watched with growing interest as the raven worked. Its waters danced around him, sometimes helping, sometimes testing his resolve with unexpected currents. "The land you seek to create will forever change the face of the world," she commented. "My waters will have to learn new ways." The work was hard, but Kokoro didn't give up. Little by little, he began to push the mass up towards the surface. As it rose, the matter began to transform, hardening and taking shape under the influence of air and light. First a rocky peak emerged, then another and another. The sun, on its first full pass through the sky, witnessed the birth of the first mountains. Their dark slopes rose from the waters like sleeping giants, dripping primordial water back into the ocean. The moon, in its first cycle, bathed the new lands in its silvery light, revealing valleys and plains that formed between the peaks. But Kokoro knew that bare earth wasn't enough. With his wings, he began to spread different types of soil over the basic rock. Here a layer of fertile earth, there a bed of clay, further on a field of sand. Each type of soil had its purpose in the grand plan that was developing in his creative mind. The stars, watching from above, seemed to twinkle with approval as the world below them gained more complexity and texture. Their reflections in Namaka's waters created patterns that inspired Kokoro to continue his creative work. "I see the purpose in your work," said Namaka, his waves now crashing against the new rocky shores. "But I also see that this is only the beginning. The land you raise from my depths is still bare and empty." Raven landed on the highest peak of the first mountain he had created. From this privileged vantage point, he could see his creation stretching out in all directions. The lands that emerged from the waters formed complex patterns: archipelagos, peninsulas, deep valleys, and vast plains. With a flick of his wings, Kokoro began to create rivers and lakes, natural channels where the waters of Namaka could flow and settle over the new land. These waterways would be the veins of the world, bringing life and nutrients to every corner of his creation. Every drop that flows over your land carries a promise. Observe Namaka, feeling its waters divide and find new paths across the newborn continent. "I see the potential for life in every stream and lake you create." Namaka's words touched something deep in Raven's heart. Yes, life, this would be his next great challenge. But before he could take this step, he needed to prepare the ground properly. With meticulous care, he began to work on the texture of the earth, creating different environments that would one day house different forms of life. Using his powers of creation, he shaped caves in the bowels of the mountains, carved fertile valleys between the elevations, and created plains that stretched to the horizon. Each environment had its own personality, its own story to tell. The sun completed another cycle, and the moon once again bathed the new land in its silvery light. The stars continued their eternal dance in the sky, silent witnesses to Raven's tireless work. Every moment, the world took on more detail, more complexity. Kokoro knew that his work with the earth was almost complete, but something was still missing. The rocky surfaces and bare soil cried out for cover, for color, for life. His keen eye could already see the forests that would grow on the mountain slopes, the fields that would flourish on the plains, the algae that would dance in the shallows. With his wings spread, capturing the combined energy of the sun and the moon, the Raven was preparing for his next great work. The creation of plant life would be his next challenge, and he could already feel the creative energy flowing through his feathers. Eager to begin this new phase of his creative journey, Namaka, sensing Kokoro's thoughts, moved his waters in a pattern that suggested expectation. "You have shaped the earth wisely," she said, her waves gently caressing the new shores. "Now it's time to cover it with the green mantle of life." Raven nodded silently, his eyes shining with the reflection of the stars. The stage was set for the next act of creation, and he couldn't wait to start painting his world with the colors of life. With his unwavering determination, Kokoro began his next act of creation. Hovering over the newly formed earth, he could feel the life energy pulsing through his black feathers. The bare soil was eagerly awaiting the touch that would transform it into a verdant paradise. First, Raven focused his attention on the banks where land and water met. With delicate movements of his wings, he scattered the first seeds of life, small algae and mosses that quickly established themselves on the damp rocks. These first life forms were simple, but fundamental to what was to come. "I see you start at the beginning," observed Namaka, his waters gently nurturing the new green creatures. "As always, your wisdom shows in the details." Kokoro continued his methodical work, gradually moving from the banks to the interior. In each different type of soil he had created, he now planted a specific variety of plant life. On the rocky slopes, he planted resistant lichens and small plants that clung to the rocks with fierce determination. As his work progressed, the plants began to evolve and diversify of their own accord, as if they had captured Raven's creative essence. Small shoots grew into bushes, which in turn inspired the birth of ever larger trees. The first forests began to appear on the slopes of the mountains, with a mixture of sun, rain, and fertile soil created the perfect conditions for growth. Kokoro watched with satisfaction as different species of trees established themselves, some tall and majestic, others twisted and ancient in their wisdom. Each plant has its own spirit, he murmured, landing briefly on a newly formed branch. Each one tells its own story. On the plains, Raven sowed vast fields of grasses that rippled in the wind like the waters of Namaka. The prairies stretched to the horizon, their colors changing with the passing of the sun and moon. In some places, wildflowers began to sprout spontaneously, adding vibrant spots of color to the landscape. Namaka watched in amazement as her aquatic world was complemented by this explosion of terrestrial life. Her waters now not only reflected the lights in the sky, but also the infinite shades of green that Kokoro had brought into being. In the wettest areas, where fresh water accumulated in swamps and marshes, Corvo created specially adapted plants, tall reeds, sturdy cattails, and delicate aquatic plants that floated on the surface of the calm waters. Each environment had its own signature plant, perfectly adapted to the local conditions. As the plants became established, the first natural cycles began to emerge. Leaves fell and decomposed, further enriching the soil. Seeds were carried by the wind, finding new places to germinate. The earth itself seemed to breathe with this new life. "You've created more than plants," said Namaka, observing the complex systems that were forming. "You've created communities, you've created relationships. You've created a living fabric that connects everything." Raven silently agreed. He could feel the connections forming between the roots in the soil, between the treetops above, between the different species that now shared the space. It was a web of life that was becoming more complex by the moment. In special places, Kokoro created natural sanctuaries of extraordinary beauty, hidden valleys where rare flowers bloomed in cascades of color, ancient forests where gigantic trees stood like pillars of heaven, natural gardens where every plant seemed to have been placed with artistic precision. The work continued tirelessly. In the driest regions, Corvo created resistant plants that knew how to conserve water, peculiarly shaped cacti, thorny shrubs, and small succulents that sparkled like jewels in the desert sun. Each adaptation was a new expression of their creativity. In the higher mountains, where the air was thinner and the cold more intense, he established a specially hardy vegetation, small alpine flowers that burst into vibrant color during the brief growing seasons, and low, twisted trees that survive the strongest winds. As the green blanket spread across the world, Kokoro realized that he was creating more than just plants. He was laying the foundations for all life to come. The forests, prairies, and swamps would be the cradle of the future creatures that would inhabit his world. The stage is almost set, he thought, his black wings reflecting the shades of green that now dominated the landscape. Just one last touch to go before we can welcome the next inhabitants of this world. With that thought, Raven set to work on his next challenge, creating plants that could provide sustenance for the creatures to come. Fruit trees began to appear in sheltered valleys, their tops laden with juicy fruit. Nutritious grains grew in the fields, and energy-rich roots established themselves in the fertile soil. Namaka, ever observant, noticed how each new addition to the plant world seemed to follow a larger plan. "You think of those that come after," she commented, her waters nourishing the roots of the plants that reach their depths. "Every seed you plant carries the potential to sustain many lives." The sun and moon continued their eternal dance across the sky, marking the passage of time as the world below transformed into a living, pulsating garden. The stars twinkled above the treetops, their reflections now multiplied in the dewy leaves and night flowers that opened only under their silvery light. Kokoro knew that his work with the plant kingdom was almost complete, but he also felt that something even greater awaited him. The plants had brought color and life to the world, but there was still a lack of movement, a lack of voices, a lack of creatures who could appreciate and inhabit this paradise he had created. With his wings open to the wind, Raven contemplated his next great challenge, to bring into being the beings that would give life and movement to this green world. It would be his most complex and important creation yet, and he couldn't wait to get started. Kokoro flew over his verdant world, admiring the symphony of life he had created. The forests whispered ancient secrets, the prairies danced with the wind, and the waters of Namaka reflected the celestial ballet of the sun, moon, and stars. But Raven felt that his work was not yet complete. The final breath of life was missing, the creatures that would give voice and movement to this majestic scenery. Landing gently on an old branch, Kokoro began to gather his creative energy. This time, her work would be more delicate and complex than ever. Creating living beings would require not only form and substance, but also spirit and purpose. The waters yearned for inhabitants, whispered Namaka, his waves gently lapping the verdant shores. I feel the emptiness in the depths that only life can fill. The raven nodded and, with a graceful movement of its wings, began its work in the waters. First came the fish, small and bright, cutting through the waves and silvery shores. Then larger creatures emerged from the depths, playful dolphins, majestic whales, and a myriad of sea creatures that filled Namaka's oceans with movement and purpose. But Kokoro didn't just stop at the waters. Turning his attention to dry land, he began to populate the forests and grasslands. From the smallest insects to the most imposing mammals, each creature was carefully thought out to occupy its specific place in the great fabric of life. Birds were his most special creations. As he himself had wings, he paid extra attention to his winged cousins. Delicate hummingbirds, majestic eagles, wise owls. Each was given a unique gift, a special way to contribute to the harmony of the world. You create not just bodies, but stories, observed Namaka, watching as each creature integrated perfectly into its surroundings. The butterflies danced among the flowers she had seen Kokoro plant. The deer grazed on the prairies he had sown, and the bears found shelter in the caves he had carved. As the creatures multiplied, they began to establish their own relationships and cycles. Predator and prey, pollinator and flower, each being found its role in the great dance of life. The once silent world now pulsed with roars, chants, hums, and calls. Kokoro flew from one habitat to another, adjusting and refining his creation. In the mountains, agile goats and majestic eagles made the heights their home. In the swamps, frogs and herons created a natural orchestra of sounds. In the grasslands, herds of herbivores grazed peacefully under the watchful eye of predators. Each creature carries a spark of your creative essence, said Namaka, observing how life spread and adapted. I see your wisdom in the way each one finds its place. Raven continued his work, now focusing on the smallest details. He created insects to pollinate flowers and aerate the soil, small rodents to spread seeds, and a myriad of microscopic creatures to maintain the balance of ecosystems. The seasons began to influence animal behavior. Some migrated as the weather changed, others hibernated during colder periods, and still others adapted their appearance and behavior to suit the different times of year. You have created more than life, observed Namaka. You have created stories that will unfold for generations. And so was, each creature had its own role in the world's grand narrative. The songbirds heralded the dawn, the wolves howled at the moon that Kokoro had released, and the whales sang ancient melodies in the depths of Namaka. The raven landed again on the highest peak, observing his creation in all its glory. The world was now a vibrant and dynamic place, where each being lived in harmony with the others and their environment. It is done, he finally said, his words echoing through time. The world is complete. Namaka moved his waters in a pattern of agreement. Yes, it is complete but never finished. What you have created will continue to grow, change, and adapt. Each creature carries within it the potential for evolution and transformation. And so, Kokoro, the Raven creator, completed his great work. The world that had once been just darkness and water now pulsed with life in all its forms. The celestial lights he had unleashed illuminated a planet rich in diversity and beauty. But even though he had completed his task, Raven knew that his role was not over. Now he would be the guardian, the observer, the one who would watch over the delicate balance he had established. The stars continued their eternal dance in the sky. The sun and moon kept up their perpetual dance, and the waters of Namaka embraced the earth with their ancient wisdom. And in the midst of all this, Kokoro flew, his black wings reflecting the light that he himself had brought to the world, eternal guardian of the creation that had been born from his power and his imagination. The world was complete, but its story had only just begun. Every sunrise would bring new adventures. Every moonset would hold new mysteries. And every shining star would bear witness to the infinite stories that were yet to come in the world Raven had created. Flames consumed Troy, dyeing the night sky red as desperate cries echoed through the once majestic streets. Aeneas, a Trojan prince and respected warrior, watched his hometown succumb to the Greek siege with a mixture of horror and disbelief. The famous wooden horse, which hours before had been celebrated as a gift from the gods, had turned out to be a death trap, unleashing Greek soldiers who were now massacring his people. In the midst of the chaos, Aeneas carried his elderly father, Anchises, on his shoulders. The old man's weight was considerable, but the prince's determination was greater. Beside him, his little son Ascanius clung to his tunic, his wide eyes reflecting the terror of the destruction around him. The thick smoke made breathing difficult, and the heat from the flames was almost unbearable. "Father, we need to hurry," whispered Aeneas, adjusting Anchises' weight as he led his family through narrow alleyways, avoiding the main thoroughfares where the battle was still raging. His wife Creusa followed close behind, but fate had other plans for her. In the confusion of their escape, her silhouette disappeared into the darkness, a moment that would haunt Aeneas for years to come. As they escaped through the ruined city, divine visions began to manifest themselves. Venus, Aeneas' divine mother, appeared in a golden flash, her words echoing with supernatural authority. "My son, your destiny does not end with Troy. The gods have chosen you for a greater mission, to found a new civilization that will surpass even the glory of Priam." The words of his divine mother resounded in his mind as he led the survivors to the port. A small group of loyal Trojans had managed to prepare ships for the escape and were now waiting for their leader. The sea, black as ink under the blazing sky, promised an escape but also unknown dangers. On Olympus, the gods watched with varied interest. While Venus protected her son, Juno, Jupiter's powerful wife, simmered with hatred. Her aversion to the Trojans, fueled by ancient prophecies and rivalries, led her to swear that she would make Aeneas' journey an endless torment. As he embarked with his companions, Aeneas took one last look at Troy. The city that had once been the symbol of greatness and civilization was now nothing but smoking ruins. Silent tears streamed down his face as he held Ascanius close to his chest, silently promising that he would find a new home for his people. The sea welcomed them with a deceptive calm. The makeshift fleet of Trojan ships began their journey under a gradually brightening sky, but Aeneas knew the peace wouldn't last. Juno was already moving her pieces, summoning Aeolus, Lord of the Winds, to unleash storms that would test the refugees' resolve. Among the survivors was Achates, Aeneas' closest friend and most trusted advisor. "Where are we going?" he asked, looking at the uncertain horizon. Aeneas, contemplating the prophecies and visions he had received, replied with a conviction he didn't fully feel. "To the west, where the gods have promised our new land." The initial days at sea were marked by a mixture of mourning and hope. The Trojans mourned their dead while trying to keep their traditions and rituals alive. Anchises, though weakened, became a source of wisdom and consolation, recounting ancient prophecies that spoke of a new Troy rising from the ashes of the old one. Ascanius, still too young to fully understand the magnitude of his loss, adapted to life at sea with the resilience characteristic of children. Aeneas watched his son with a mixture of pride and concern, knowing that the future they sought would depend a lot on this little prince. At night, when most people rested, Aeneas stayed awake on deck, studying the stars and looking for signs of the gods. The constellations seemed different from the ones he knew in Troy, as if even the sky wanted to remind him that there was no turning back. In his moments of solitude, he thought of Creusa and all those who had been left behind. The ships continued their journey west, while rumors and stories circulated among the crew about distant lands and unknown peoples. Some spoke of Carthage, a prosperous city ruled by a widowed queen. Others mentioned the mysterious Italian peninsula, where ancient prophecies said the Trojans would meet their fate. But before they could contemplate much about their fate, Juno decided to act. The clouds began to gather on the horizon, first as small white flakes, then as dark, threatening masses. The sea, until then relatively calm, began to churn with a supernatural fury. Aeneas realized that his journey had only just begun and that each day would bring new challenges. As he prepared his crew for the coming storm, he silently renewed his commitment to the mission the gods had entrusted to him. The future of his people, the promise of a new civilization, and the fate of his son depended on his ability to persevere. The first gale hit the ships with brutal force, marking the beginning of a series of trials that would test not only the Trojans' nautical skills, but also their faith in the gods and their leader. Aeneas, standing at the bow of his ship, faced the rising waves with the determination of a man who had already lost everything once and was willing to fight to the end for a new beginning. The storm sent by Juno grew in intensity, turning the Mediterranean Sea into a battlefield between the Trojan ships and the forces of nature. Gigantic waves rose up like liquid walls, threatening to swallow out the entire fleet. Aeneas, clinging to the tiller of his ship, struggled to maintain control as he watched with growing despair the other ships being scattered by the fury of the elements. "Father of the gods, help us," he shouted amid the roar of the storm, his words almost lost in the howling wind. Ascanius was safe below deck with Anchises, but several of his men were thrown overboard by the merciless waves. Achates desperately coordinated efforts to rescue the fallen sailors, while others struggled to keep the sails intact. On Olympus, Neptune noticed Juno's interference in his domain. Angry at the intrusion into his seas, the god of the oceans emerged from the depths in his chariot pulled by seahorses. With a wave of his trident, he began to calm the waters, rebuking the winds that had dared to disturb his kingdom without his permission. Gradually, the storm subsided, leaving behind a drastically reduced and dispersed fleet. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, Aeneas could assess the damage. Of the 20 ships that had set sail from Troy, only 7 remained in sight. The Trojan prince's heart was heavy at the loss of so many compatriots, but there was no time for prolonged mourning. The surviving ships found refuge in a bay near the north coast of Africa. It was a natural cove, protected by rocky cliffs that stood like silent sentinels. The Trojans, exhausted and drenched, began to disembark on the beach, thanking the gods for having survived Juno's fury. Aeneas, showing his characteristic leadership, immediately organized search parties to hunt and collect supplies. Others were assigned to repair the damaged ships, while a third group set up a temporary camp. Ascanius, always curious, explored the beach under the watchful eye of his grandfather Anchises, who took advantage of his time off to interpret the divine signs. During one of their hunting expeditions, Aeneas and Achates found signs of civilization. Not far from the coast, smoke was rising through the trees, indicating the presence of a city. It was Carthage, although they didn't know it yet, a city under construction under the command of the determined Queen Dido. Venus, ever vigilant about the fate of her son, decided to intervene. Disguised as a young huntress, she appeared before Aeneas and Achates, revealing to them the history of Carthage and its queen. Dido, a Phoenician princess who had fled from her tyrant brother, had established a new kingdom on the African coast, attracting followers and building a city that promised to rival the greatest in the known world. "The queen will understand your situation," said Venus, her eyes shining with divine knowledge. "She also knows the weight of leading a people in exile." Before disappearing in a golden aura, the goddess enveloped Aeneas in a magical mist that would make him invisible, allowing him to observe Carthage unnoticed. Aeneas and Achates approached the city under construction, amazed at the energy and organization they found. Workers were erecting monumental walls. Others were paving streets and building temples. It was a sight reminiscent of the ancient glory of Troy, awakening in Aeneas bittersweet memories of his lost home. In the center of the city, they found a temple dedicated to Juno, its walls already decorated with murals telling the story of the fall of Troy. Aeneas stopped, moved, to see depictions of battles in which he himself had fought. "Even here our fame precedes us," he muttered to Achates. "There are places in the world where our struggles are known and our pain is understood." Venus' protective mist dissipated as Dido entered the temple to conduct the day's business. The queen was an impressive figure, combining beauty and natural authority. Her regal bearing and determined expression spoke of someone who, like Aeneas, had overcome great adversity to lead her people to a new beginning. When Aeneas revealed himself, introducing himself and his people, Dido immediately recognized the opportunity that lay ahead. Carthage could benefit from the Trojans' strength and skill, while offering them a safe haven. "Welcome to Carthage," she declared, her voice carrying both authority and compassion. "We know well the trials of Troy, and here you will find shelter." News of Dido's hospitality quickly spread among the Trojans camped on the beach. Soon, arrangements were made to accommodate the refugees within the walls of the city under construction. The Trojans, accustomed to hard work and discipline, quickly integrated themselves into the construction effort, contributing their experience and manpower. As the days turned into weeks, a routine began to establish itself. The Trojans found a temporary purpose helping to build Carthage, while Dido and Aeneas spent more and more time together, discussing matters of government and sharing stories of their respective journeys. A natural closeness began to develop between them, although neither would admit it at first. Anchises, watching events unfold with the wisdom of years, began to express concern. "We mustn't forget our destiny," he reminded Aeneas during a quiet night. "The gods have promised us a new land in Italy. Carthage may be welcoming, but it's not our final destination." As Carthage grew, so did the attraction between Dido and Aeneas. The queen found in the Trojan prince not only a valuable ally, but someone who understood the weight of leadership and the scars of exile. During the evening banquets in the royal palace, Dido drank in every word of the stories Aeneas told about the fall of Troy and his perilous journey across the sea. "Tell me more about your city," she would often ask, her eyes shining in the torchlight. And Aeneas would talk, reliving painful memories, but finding solace in the understanding he saw on the queen's face. The evenings stretched into long conversations, and the servants noticed how their queen seemed more alive, more radiant in the presence of the Trojan prince. Cupid, at Venus' request, had planted the seed of love in Dido's heart, ensuring that the Trojans would find protection in Carthage. The little god of love, disguised as Ascanius, had touched the queen with his enchanted arrows during one of the first banquets. Now that seed was blossoming into a deep and dangerous feeling. The days in Carthage took on a rhythm of their own. The Trojans took an active part in building the city, their skills in architecture and engineering proving invaluable. Aeneas often supervised the work alongside Dido, discussing plans for fortifications and temples. Their shoulders would sometimes touch during these inspections, sending shivers through both their bodies. Ascanius thrived in his new environment, making friends among the Carthaginian children and learning their games and customs. Anchises, meanwhile, became increasingly restless. At night, the old man studied the omens and consulted the oracles, all of which pointed to Italy as the Trojans' true destiny. The gods didn't bring us this far to settle here, he warned Aeneas in private conversations. Every day we spend in Carthage, we move further away from our divine destiny. His words weighed heavily on Aeneas' heart, as he found himself torn between duty and his growing feelings for Dido. The situation came to a head during a royal hunt, when a sudden storm forced Dido and Aeneas to seek shelter in an isolated cave. Their pent-up feelings could no longer be denied. There, protected from the rain and cut off from the world, they finally gave themselves over to the passion that had been growing between them. News of their union spread quickly throughout Carthage. Dido, who had sworn never to marry again after the death of her first husband, now considered her relationship with Aeneas to be a de facto marriage. The Carthaginians, meanwhile, began to murmur. Some nobles viewed the growing influence of the Trojans in the city with suspicion. Juno watched events with perverse satisfaction. If Aeneas established himself in Carthage, the prophecies about Rome would never come true. The goddess began to spread rumors among the Carthaginians, feeding their suspicions about the Trojans' true intentions. Winter arrived, and with it an apparent stability. Aeneas seemed to have temporarily forgotten his destiny, lost in the pleasures of his life with Dido and the responsibilities of helping to govern Carthage. The Trojan ships remained anchored in the harbor, slowly being covered in seaweed and barnacles. But Jupiter could not allow fate to be diverted. The king of the gods sent Mercury, his messenger, with a stern message for Aeneas. The winged god found the prince supervising the construction of new walls, dressed in Carthaginian clothes and wearing local jewelry. "Have you forgotten who you are?" thundered Mercury, his voice carrying the authority of Jupiter. "The gods didn't save you from Troy so that you could build the walls of another city. Your destiny and the future of your son awaits in Italy. Every moment you spend here is a betrayal of your people and of God's will." The god's words struck Aeneas like a thunderbolt. All the guilt he had suppressed, all the weight of fate he had tried to ignore, came back in full force. He knew Mercury was right. He couldn't go on living this borrowed life in Carthage. In secret, Aeneas began to prepare for his departure. He ordered his men to repair the ships and gather supplies, all under the pretext of a trading expedition. His heart broke at the thought of Dido, but his duty to his people and his divine destiny could no longer be ignored. But in a city where the walls have ears, secrets rarely remain hidden for long. Rumors of Trojan preparations reached the ears of Dido, who initially refused to believe them. When the truth could no longer be denied, her grief turned into a fury that shook the foundations of Carthage. Confronting Aeneas in his private chambers, Dido let all her anguish spill over. "Is this how you repay my hospitality, my love?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "I broke my vows for you, gave up my heart and my kingdom, and you plan to leave like a thief in the night." Aeneas tried to explain about fate, about divine orders, but his words rang hollow in the face of Dido's genuine pain. "The gods you mention are cruel," she replied bitterly. "What kind of fate requires you to break the heart of the one who loved and protected you?" The news of the Trojans' imminent departure divided Carthage. Some citizens, who had developed bonds of friendship with the refugees, regretted their departure. Others saw it as confirmation of their suspicions about Aeneas' true intentions. The night before his planned departure, Aeneas couldn't sleep. His thoughts oscillated between his divine duty and the love he felt for Dido. The preparations were complete, and his men were waiting for his orders to set sail at the first sign of dawn. Outside her chambers, Carthage remained restless, as if the city itself sensed the imminent separation. Dido, consumed by anguish, sought advice from her sister Anna, who tried in vain to calm her tormented spirit. "Maybe we can still convince him to stay," Anna suggested, but Dido had already noticed the determination in Aeneas' eyes. She knew that look. It was the same one she saw in her own reflection when she decided to flee Tyre to found Carthage. Meanwhile, Ascanius, who had grown fond of life in Carthage, questioned his father about the need to leave. "Why can't we stay here? We have a home now," the boy asked, his innocence making the answer even more difficult for Aeneas. Our destiny calls us elsewhere, son. Sometimes we must follow the path that the gods have laid out, even when our hearts desire another course. The Trojans began to move silently through the city before dawn, loading supplies and equipment onto the ships. The atmosphere was tense, with some Carthaginians watching in silence, others discreetly helping their Trojan friends. The loyalty that had developed between the two peoples made the separation all the more painful. From the top of her tower, Dido watched the preparations with a mixture of despair and anger. Her hands trembled as she held an amulet that Aeneas had given her, a gift from Troy that now seemed to mock her betrayed trust. In a fit of rage, she summoned a priestess known for her mystical arts. The priestess, an old woman from the countryside, began to prepare a cursed ritual. Herbs were burned on a makeshift altar, while ancient words were muttered under the light of the fading stars. Dido, although hesitant at first, felt that her pain needed an outlet. Aeneas, feeling the weight of his decision, made one last attempt to explain himself. He found Dido in her private gardens, where they had so often shared moments of happiness. "I'm not leaving for lack of love," he began, "but because a destiny greater than both of us is calling me." Dido's reply was as sharp as a blade. "Your destiny? What about the destiny we've built here? Of the promises we made? The walls we built together?" Her words carried not only accusation, but a deep disappointment that made Aeneas question his resolve once again. At the port, Achates was overseeing the final preparations, keeping an eye out for any sign of trouble. Some Carthaginian sailors, loyal to Dido, seemed ready to prevent the departure, but were restrained by superior orders. The queen, even in her grief, would not allow blood to be shed. In his last moments in Carthage, Anchises made offerings to the gods, asking for protection for the journey ahead. The old man felt the weight of responsibility for having insisted on leaving, but he remained firm in his conviction that they were following the right path. As dawn approached, the tension in the city reached its peak. Dido, in a last act of defiance, climbed to the highest point of her palace. From there, she could see all of Carthage and the port where the Trojan ships were preparing to set sail. Her solitary figure, cut out against the sky that was beginning to lighten, became a symbol of the tragedy that was unfolding. The first rays of sunlight found the Trojan fleet already on the move. Aeneas, on the deck of his flagship, forced himself not to look back, fearing that his resolve would falter if he saw Carthage one last time. But the cry that tore through the morning air made every Trojan heart tremble. It was Dido's voice, full of pain and fury, proclaiming her curse. "May there never be peace between our peoples. May future generations bear the weight of this betrayal. May the sea and the earth rise against you, Aeneas, just as my heart rises in curse." The queen's words seemed to have a power of their own, echoing over the waters and making the sails of the ships shudder. Some Trojan sailors made gestures to ward off evil, while others prayed silently for divine protection. Aeneas, while maintaining his stoic expression, felt every word like an arrow in his chest. Ascanio, clinging to the ship's rail, looked out over the city he had learned to call home. Silent tears streamed down his young face as he tried to understand why fate demanded such painful sacrifices. His father, noticing his son's distress, placed a protective hand on his shoulder, but found no words of consolation. As Carthage receded into the horizon, dark smoke began to rise from the city. Rumors swirled among the ships about a great fire in the royal palace, but Aeneas forbade any mention of returning. Fate was calling them forward to Italy, and the price of looking back had already proved too high. The fleet was now sailing under a sky that seemed heavier, as if carrying the weight of curses and broken promises. The Trojans, although united in their common destiny, felt that something fundamental had changed. Their stay in Carthage had transformed them, and the consequences of this transformation would echo through the centuries to come. The Trojan fleet now faced turbulent waters, as if the sea itself were responding to Dido's curse. The waves beat against the ship's hulls with renewed force, while dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Aeneas, still tormented by the events in Carthage, stood firm at his post, his eyes fixed in the direction the oracles had indicated. Achates approached his leader, noticing the deep circles under his eyes that marked his friend's face. "The men are restless," he reported in a low voice. "Some fear that Dido's curse will haunt us to the end." Aeneas nodded silently, understanding his companion's fear, for he himself felt the weight of that departure on his soul. During the nights, when sleep didn't come, Aeneas was haunted by visions. He saw Dido in her last hours in Carthage, her haughty figure transformed by the pain of betrayal. In his nightmares, the flames that consumed the palace seemed to reach him across distances, painfully reminding him of the fall of Troy. Ascanius, showing a maturity beyond his years, began to spend more time with his grandfather Anchises, absorbing the ancient stories and prophecies that spoke of his fate in Italy. The boy was beginning to understand the weight of the inheritance he was carrying, although his heart still held sweet memories of his days in Carthage. The journey continued for days that turned into weeks. The winds, sometimes favorable, sometimes contrary, seemed to play with the Trojans' determination. During a refueling stop on a small island, Anchises fell seriously ill. The fever that overtook the old man worried everyone, especially as his words of wisdom had become fundamental to maintaining the crew's morale. "Don't let my condition divert you from our purpose," whispered Aeneas to Aeneas during a moment of lucidity. "Italy awaits, and with it the fate of our people." His words were interspersed with coughing fits that made his frail body tremble. Aeneas held his father's hand, feeling as if each of the old man's labored breaths was another weight on his shoulders. As they approached the coast of Sicily, the omens became more frequent. Birds of unknown species flew over the ships, and some nights were illuminated by shooting stars that crisscrossed the sky in patterns that the elders interpreted as divine signs. It was in the waters near Sicily that Anchises, the wise counselor and beloved father, closed his eyes for the last time. His death, although expected, struck Aeneas like a brutal blow. The funeral took place according to Trojan rituals, with the old man's body being consigned to the flames on a makeshift pyre on the Sicilian coast. During the funeral ceremonies, Aeneas realized that he had lost not only his father, but also a vital link to Troy's past. Anchises had been the guardian of traditions, the interpreter of divine signs, and his absence left a void that seemed impossible to fill. The stop in Sicily lasted longer than planned. The funeral games in honor of Anchises brought together not only the Trojans, but also the locals who joined in the celebrations. Competitions in running, wrestling, and archery helped renew the crew's spirit, reminding them of the glories of their past and the promises of their future. It was during these games that Ascanio really began to stand out as a future leader. His skill with the bow and his natural grace in the equestrian events drew applause from the spectators and filled Aeneas with pride. The boy who had left Troy on his father's shoulders was turning into a young prince worthy of his lineage. As the games continued, some Trojan women, exhausted from the long journey and fearful of further dangers at sea, began to question the need to continue. Inspired by Juno, who had not yet given up on preventing the Trojans' fate, they set fire to some of the fleet's ships during the night. The ensuing chaos once again tested Aeneas' leadership. Torn between saving the ships and maintaining the unity of his people, he was forced to make difficult decisions. Some Trojans, especially the elderly and families with young children, were allowed to remain in Sicily, with a local king offered land for their settlement. With a reduced fleet, but a more determined crew, the Trojans finally resumed their journey towards Italy. Anchises' last words echoed in Aeneas' mind. Destiny awaited them, and no obstacle, no matter how great, could stop them from reaching it. As the shores of Italy began to appear on the horizon, a new energy took hold of the ships. Years of travel, loss, and hardship had forged this group of refugees into something stronger. They were no longer just survivors of Troy, but the founders of something new, the bearers of a legacy that would transcend their own lives. Aeneas, standing at the bow of his ship, contemplated the future that was approaching. The prophecies spoke of wars to come, of alliances to be forged, and of an empire that would surpass all others. But at that moment, watching his son Ascanius by his side, and feeling the spiritual presence of his father Anchises, he knew that all the losses and sacrifices had not been in vain. The waters that separated them from their destination seemed calmer now, as if the gods themselves recognized that this epic journey was coming to an end. The setting sun tinted the sky golden, and in those colors Aeneas saw the promise of a new dawn for his people. Night fell over the small town of Pine Grove, Maryland, as Sarah Matthews finished her shift at the local library. Through the old windows of the historic building, the sun was bidding farewell, painting the sky with orange hues that gradually gave way to darkness. At 28, Sarah had become accustomed to the quiet routine of the library, but something about that particular evening made her uneasy. As she organized the last few books on the shelves, her thoughts wandered to the stories that had begun to circulate around the city in recent weeks. Rumors about a half-man, half-goat creature that was terrorizing the most remote areas of the forest surrounding Pine Grove. As a librarian, Sarah had always had a special fascination with urban legends and local folklore, but there was something different about these recent reports. Mark Anderson, her best friend and ranger at the local state park, had shared some disturbing information with her over lunch that day. "Sarah, we found 3 more sites with signs of unexplained activity," he had said, his normally confident voice trembling slightly. "Axe marks on trees, strange footprints, and blood." Sarah put the last book away and picked up her bag, preparing to face the short walk home. Living on the edge of town, her route always included a stretch through the forest. Normally, this never bothered her, but that night, every shadow seemed to hide a thread. As she walked, her mind drifted back to a conversation she'd had with Dr. James Harrison, a retired scientist who frequented the library regularly. He had worked at the local government laboratory for decades before retiring abruptly the previous year. The last time she saw him, he looked troubled, frantically leafing through books on genetics and mutations. "Sometimes, Sarah," he had whispered, "science goes too far. There are things we shouldn't try to understand or control." At the time, she hadn't given his words much weight, but now, each one echoed in her mind with new meaning. A twig snapped in the darkness, bringing Sarah to an abrupt halt. Her heart raced as her eyes tried to penetrate the density of the forest. For a moment, she could have sworn she saw 2 red dots shining between the trees, like eyes watching her movements. The next morning, Sarah arrived early at the library, determined to research more about the government laboratory and its history. In her files, she found newspaper clippings dating back a year, reporting the sudden closure of an entire wing of the lab after an unspecified incident. Mark showed up around noon, looking even more worried than the day before. "We found something," he said, placing a photograph on the table. It was a picture of a footprint in the mud, unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. It looked like an impossible mix between a human imprint and a goat's hoof. "That's not all," continued Mark, lowering his voice even further. "Last night, a couple were attacked in the camping area. They managed to escape but described something that shouldn't be there. They talked about red eyes and a scream that sounded both human and animal." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine as she remembered the red dots she had seen the night before. "Mark, I think we need to investigate more about the lab. Dr. Harrison has been acting strangely, and some of the things he said." Before he could finish, the library door opened, and Dr. Harrison himself rushed in. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking as he clutched an old folder. Seeing Sarah and Mark, he hesitated for a moment before approaching. "You need to know the truth," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "What's happening, it's all my fault. We went too far with the experiments. We tried to create something we shouldn't have, and now," his voice faltered. Sarah and Mark exchanged worried glances as Dr. Harrison opened the folder, revealing classified documents and old photographs of the lab. It was a secret project, he continued, focused on genetic improvement. "We started with animals, trying to create more resistant hybrids. But then, a sudden clap of thunder made everyone jump. A storm was approaching, and through the windows of the library, they could see dark clouds gathering rapidly. Dr. Harrison looked increasingly agitated. "He's out there," he muttered, glancing nervously at the windows. "My creation, my mistake. And now he's hunting. I can no longer control what we've created." Sarah felt her world spin as she absorbed the information. The urban legends, the attacks, the rumors, it was all starting to make terrible sense. Something had escaped from the lab. Something that wasn't supposed to exist, and was now loose in the forests of Maryland. Mark put a comforting hand on her shoulder, but his eyes reflected the same fear she felt. As the storm approached and premature darkness took over the sky, the three of them remained silent in the library, each lost in their own dark thoughts about what awaited them in the coming hours. The distant sound of a scream, not quite human, not quite animal, echoed through the walls of the library, causing everyone to freeze. The creature was approaching the city, and they were the only ones who knew the truth about its origin. Now, they had to decide what to do with this information before more people became victims of the experiment that had gone horribly wrong. Dr. Harrison spread the documents out on the library table, his hands still shaking as he organized the photographs and reports. Sarah and Mark leaned over to examine the material, trying to ignore the distant sounds of the approaching storm. The black and white photographs showed sterile laboratory facilities and a series of reinforced cages that seemed designed to contain something much bigger and stronger than an ordinary goat. "The project started 15 years ago," explained Harrison, his voice low and hoarse. "At first, it was just basic research into genetic improvement in goats. We wanted to create animals that were more resistant, that could produce more milk, more meat. But then, he ran his fingers over a photograph showing a team of scientists in white lab coats. Then we discovered something extraordinary in the DNA of the goats." Sarah picked up one of the reports, her eyes roaming over the technical notes. "A protein that allowed accelerated cellular adaptation," she read aloud, frowning. "Exactly," confirmed Harrison. "We thought we could use this characteristic to develop revolutionary treatments, cures for degenerative diseases, tissue regeneration. The possibilities seemed endless." He paused, running his hand over his tired face. "But we needed a test subject closer to humans." Mark, who had been silent until then, looked up from the documents. "You didn't—" "Yes," Harrison interrupted, his voice breaking. "We use human DNA. At first, it was just cells in the lab, but the results were too impressive to ignore. The Pentagon increased our funding, and the pressure for results was constant." A particularly loud clap of thunder rattled the windows of the library. Sarah noticed that the temperature had dropped considerably, and a howling wind was starting to blow outside. "Dr. Reynolds was our chief scientist," Harrison continued, pointing to a tall, thin man in the photograph. "He was obsessed with the project. He would spend whole days in a lab, sleeping only a few hours. And then he hesitated, swallowing. Then he volunteered for the first human test." Sarah felt her stomach turn. "He injected the modified DNA into himself?" Harrison nodded slowly. "At first it seemed to have worked. His physical strength increased exponentially. His stamina was extraordinary. But then the changes began. First it was small things, changes in the texture of your skin, changes in the timbre of your voice. We tried to stop the process, but it was too late." Mark stood up abruptly, walking over to the window. The storm was now upon them, and the rain was starting to fall heavily. "How long until he transforms completely?" 3 days, replied Harrison, his voice only a whisper. "On the 3rd day, he broke containment. He killed 2 security guards before fleeing into the forest. The government buried everything, classified the files, closed the lab. But he's out there, and every day that passes, a distant scream cut through the air, closer than the previous one." Sarah felt her hair stand on end as she recognized the grotesque mixture of human and animal sound. "He's getting bolder," said Harrison, putting the documents back in his briefcase. "At first, he kept his distance from populated areas, but the transformation continues. More and more, the human mind gives way to animal instincts." Sarah picked up her phone, checking the local news. 3 attacks in the last week, she reported. All close to the city. People were starting to notice a pattern. Mark returned to the table, his face determined. We need to do something. We can't let any more people get hurt. There's something I haven't told you, said Harrison, hesitantly. In the last experiments before the incident, we developed a serum that could theoretically reverse the process. It's never been tested, but where is it? Asked Sarah, leaning forward. In the laboratory, in the same building where it all happened. It's locked away in a special freezer in the basement. A flash of lightning lit up the library, followed immediately by a deafening clap of thunder. The lights flickered on and off, leaving them in semi-darkness. The emergency generator hummed, and a few security lights came on, creating unsettling shadows on the shelves. We need that serum, said Mark, his voice firm despite the fear evident in his eyes. It's our only chance of stopping this. Sarah nodded, although her heart was racing. The lab is less than an hour away. If we go now... Harrison shook his head vehemently. It's too dangerous. He knows that place. He probably uses it as territory. And with this storm... Another scream echoed through the night, this time so close that it seemed to come from across the street. The three of them instinctively moved closer, looking out of the library window into the darkness outside. The rain beat down on the deserted streets, and the street lamps created small circles of illumination in the stormy night. We have no choice, said Sarah, picking up her bag. More people are going to die if we don't do something. Dr. Harrison, we need you to guide us to the lab. The elderly scientist looked terrified, but after a moment's hesitation, he nodded slowly. There's an entrance at the back, through the underground parking lot. I could take us there, but he glanced nervously out of the window. They'll know we're coming. Mark checked his cell phone. I've got emergency equipment in my Jeep. Flashlights, ropes, first aid kit. If we leave now, we can get there before the storm gets any worse. Sarah began to gather up the documents, carefully storing them in her waterproof bag. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but her determination was greater than her fear. They had a chance to fix something that had gone terribly wrong, to stop more lives being lost. As they prepared to leave, the sound of breaking glass echoed through the empty library building. Everyone froze. The noise came from upstairs, where the rare work section was located. Heavy, jagged footsteps could be heard above their heads, followed by the distinctive sound of claws scratching the wooden floor. Sarah, Mark, and Dr. Harrison stood paralyzed, staring at the ceiling as the sounds above them continued. The creaking of the wooden floorboards indicated that the creature was moving slowly, as if sniffing something out. Harrison put a finger to his lips, signaling for them to remain absolutely silent. The back door, whispered Mark so low it was almost inaudible. If we go slowly. Before he could finish, a deafening noise came from upstairs, the sound of bookshelves being knocked over and books scattering across the floor. Sarah grabbed her bag with the documents, and the three of them began to move silently towards the emergency exit. The sound of the pouring rain partially masked their footsteps, but every movement seemed dangerously loud in their ears. When they reached the back door, Mark opened it slowly, trying to prevent the old hinges from creaking. The cold wind and rain hit them immediately. A furious scream echoed inside the library. The creature had sensed their presence. The sound was even more terrifying up close, a grotesque mixture of human scream and animal bleat that made their bones freeze. "Run!" shouted Mark, pushing Sarah and Harrison out. They shot through the rain towards Mark's Jeep, which was parked about 50 meters away. Sarah could hear sounds of destruction coming from the library, glass breaking, furniture being thrown. The creature was coming down. They arrived at the vehicle soaking wet. Mark unlocked the doors with trembling hands while Sarah helped Harrison into the back seat, which she turned to get into the passenger side. Her blood ran cold. Standing at the entrance to the library, illuminated by a flash of lightning, was the creature. It was taller than a normal man, with grotesquely deformed legs ending in hooves. Its torso was a disturbing mixture of human and goat features, covered in a dark, patchy coat. But most frightening were his eyes, two glowing red orbs that seemed to burn in the darkness. "My God," whispered Harrison. "Reynolds." The creature turned its head towards them, its eyes fixed on the elderly scientist. For a moment, something akin to recognition flashed across its deformed face. Then, with a deafening roar, it began to run towards them. Mark turned the key in the ignition and the engine roared to life. He shifted in a gear and floored the accelerator, causing the tires to spin on the wet asphalt before they could gain traction. The Jeep shot down the main street of Pine Grove, with the creature in hot pursuit. "He's too fast," shouted Sarah, looking in a rearview mirror. The creature moved impossibly fast, alternating between 2 and 4 legs, leaping over obstacles with supernatural agility. "The lab is to the east, down the old forest road," instructed Harrison, clinging to the seat as Mark made a sharp turn. The storm was getting worse by the minute. Lightning continuously cut across the sky, briefly turning night into day. The rain was so heavy that the windshield wipers were barely able to keep up. "We need to lose him," said Mark, concentrating on the steering. "Sarah, there's a flare gun in the glove compartment. When I tell you," a violent impact shook the Jeep. The creature had reached the vehicle and jumped over the bucket. Metal claws scratched the roof, and a monstrous face appeared in the window next to Sarah, who screamed and threw herself away. Mark made a sudden maneuver, throwing the Jeep into some trees by the side of the road. The creature lost its balance and fell, rolling in the mud. But before they could celebrate, they saw its form rise and resume the chase. "There," pointed out Harrison. "That entrance on the right leads to the back of the lab." Mark turned sharply, entering an almost invisible dirt road between the trees. The Jeep shook violently as they drove along the abandoned road, branches banging against the bodywork. "He's not behind us anymore," observed Sarah, tense. "That's not good," replied Harrison. "He knows this place better than we do. He's probably taking another route." After a few minutes of tense driving, they came to a high fence with barbed wire. Beyond it, partially hidden by vegetation, was a complex of low, gray buildings. "The main gate must be locked," said Harrison, "but there's a gap in the fence near the abandoned guard post." Mark parked the Jeep near the spot indicated. The rain had eased a little, but thunder still echoed in the distance. They got out of the vehicle, Mark grabbing his backpack with equipment. "The serum is in Lab C, underground," Harrison explained as they walked towards a gap in the fence. "We need to get there," and a branch snapped in the darkness to their right. Everyone stopped, tense. For a moment, only the sound of rain and wind in the trees could be heard. Then 2 red dots flashed between the shadows. "It's surrounding us," whispered Mark. The creature slowly emerged from the darkness, its monstrous body dripping with rainwater. It was less than 10 meters away from them, blocking the way to the laboratory. For the first time, they could clearly see the bloody axe in its hand, an ordinary tool transformed into a lethal weapon. Reynolds called out Harrison, stepping forward. "I know you're still in there. We can help. We have a way to reverse it." The creature tilted its head, as if processing the words. For a moment, its posture seemed less threatening. Then, its red eyes focused on the partially visible documents in Sarah's bag, and a roar of fury escaped from its deformed throat. "He doesn't want to be cured," Sarah realized with horror. "He wants to destroy any evidence of what happened here." The creature advanced, raising its axe. Mark pushed Sarah and Harrison back, frantically searching for something in his backpack. Time seemed to slow down as rain fell and lightning illuminated the grotesque scene before them. 3 humans trapped by something that shouldn't exist, something born of unbridled scientific ambition. The axe cut through the air with a deadly hiss, and the night was filled with screams of terror and bestial fury. The creature's axe met only air as Mark managed to pull Sarah and Harrison back at the last second. Taking advantage of the monster's moment of imbalance, Mark pulled a flare from his backpack and fired it directly into its glowing red eyes. The intense light made the creature cry out in pain and recoil, giving them a few precious seconds. "This way," shouted Harrison, guiding them through a narrow passage between 2 buildings. The rain continued to fall, turning the ground into slippery mud as they ran toward a side entrance to Lab C. Sarah clutched her document bag tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of the creature recovering, a mixture of furious roars and hooves pounding against the wet concrete. Harrison stopped in front of a metal door with an electronic panel. His hands were shaking as he typed in a sequence of numbers. "I hope it still works," he muttered. To his relief, a green light flashed and the door unlocked with a metallic click. They entered quickly, Mark closing the door behind them. The inside of the lab was dark and cold, lit only by the dim emergency light. The air smelled acridly of chemicals and abandonment. "The emergency generator must still be working," said Harrison, leading them down a corridor. "The freezer with the serum needs constant power." A deafening crash echoed through the building. The creature had found another entrance. The sound of metal being twisted and glass breaking indicated that it was destroying everything in its path to reach them. "This way," whispered Harrison, opening a door that led to a staircase. "The basement is a maze of corridors. We can use that to our advantage." They descended the stairs as quietly as possible, their shadows dancing on the walls in the dim light of the emergency lamps. The basement was even colder, and Sarah could see their breath forming little clouds in the air. "That thing," said Mark as they advanced down a corridor full of abandoned equipment, "does it still have any human consciousness?" Harrison hesitated before answering. Reynolds has always been intense, obsessed with his work. The physical transformation was only part of the change. His mind altered too, but in ways we don't fully understand. A distorted scream echoed through the corridors, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs. The creature had followed them underground. "There," Harrison pointed to a double door at the end of the corridor. "That's the main lab. The freezer's in there." They ran to the door, but it was locked. Harrison started typing in another code while Mark prepared his last beacon. Sarah nervously watched the corridor, her ears attentive to every sound. The door finally opened, revealing a large laboratory full of sophisticated equipment covered in plastic. Harrison rushed over to a large industrial freezer in the corner of the room. "The serum must be in here," he said, pulling out a metal drawer. "I put it here myself." He held up a small bottle containing a bluish liquid. At the same moment, the creature appeared in the doorway of the laboratory, its monstrous form framed by the dim light of the corridor. "Reynolds," Harrison called out, his voice trembling. "Look at what you've become. This isn't what we wanted. Let us help." The creature stepped forward, its red eyes fixed on the vial. For a moment, something akin to hesitation flashed across its deformed face. Then, with a sudden movement, it threw the axe. "Look out!" shouted Mark, pushing Harrison aside. The axe skimmed past, hitting the freezer and causing several vials to shatter. Sarah took advantage of the distraction to run to a side bench, looking for something she could use as a weapon. She found a fire extinguisher and threw it at Mark, who caught it in midair. The creature advanced, but Mark activated the extinguisher, creating a dense cloud of chemical powder. The monster retreated, coughing and growling, momentarily blinded. "The serum," shouted Sarah. "We need a syringe." Harrison frantically opened drawers until he found a box of sterilized syringes. With trembling hands, he began to prepare the serum while Mark kept the creature at bay with the fire extinguisher. "Even if we manage to inject it into him," said Mark, "how do we know it will work?" "We don't know," replied Harrison, his voice laden with guilt. "But it's our only chance." The creature began to recover, its red eyes glowing with fury through the chemical mist. With a deafening roar, it advanced again, knocking over equipment and tables in its path. Sarah realized that they needed a better plan than simply trying to inject the serum by force. Looking around the lab, an idea began to form in her mind. Dangerous, but perhaps her only option. "Dr. Harrison," she said, without taking her eyes off the creature, "those tanks in a corner. What's in them?" "Liquid nitrogen," he replied, "for preserving samples." "Mark," Sarah called out, "when I tell you, drop the extinguisher and run for the door." The creature was getting closer and closer, its movements calculated like a predator circling its prey. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that they would only have one chance to make this work. Time seemed to slow down as she watched the scene before her. Harrison with the syringe ready, Mark keeping the creature at bay, and the monster that had once been Dr. Reynolds, ready to pounce. The decision they made in the next few seconds would determine not only their lives, but also the fate of something that should never have existed. "Now," shouted Sarah, and Mark immediately dropped the fire extinguisher, running for the door. The creature, focused on its closest prey, advanced towards them. It was exactly what Sarah had expected. With one swift movement, she grabbed one of the tubes of liquid nitrogen and hurled it against the floor next to the creature's feet. The impact shattered the container, releasing a dense cloud of cryogenic vapor. The monster roared in pain as the supercooled liquid hit its legs, instantly freezing its fur and exposed skin. Harrison seized the opportunity, rushing over with syringe in hand. The creature, partially immobilized by the pain and intense cold, was unable to defend itself in time. The scientist stuck the needle into its neck, injecting the bluish serum. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the creature began to convulse violently. Its red eyes flashed like faulty light bulbs, and a guttural sound, more human than animal, escaped from its throat. "Is it working?" asked Mark, still near the door. "I don't know," replied Harrison, backing away slowly. The original transformation process took days. The reversal could be just as... His words were interrupted by an agonized scream from the creature. Its body began to undergo visible changes, the fur falling off in clumps, the muscles contracting and reorganizing under the skin. It was a grotesque sight, like a nightmare unraveling in slow motion. Sarah noticed something worrying. The nitrogen vapor was dissipating, and the creature was beginning to regain mobility. "We need to contain it somehow," she shouted. Mark ran to a supply closet and started throwing cables and ropes to Sarah. Together, they tried to bind the creature as it struggled on the floor, caught between two forms, neither fully human nor fully animal. "Reynolds," Harrison called out, approaching cautiously. "If you can hear me, you need to fight. Remember who you are." The creature stopped struggling for a moment, its eyes, now alternating between red and a more human tone, focused on the older scientist's face. A strange sound escaped from its throat, as if it were trying to form words. "That's right," Harrison encouraged. "You're Dr. Thomas Reynolds. Remember the lab, our work. Remember who you were before." A sudden bang shook the building, and the emergency lights flickered. The generator was failing. "If we lose power," Harrison said urgently, "all the containment systems in the lab will fail, including the ones holding other experiments." Sarah felt a chill at the thought of what else might be stored in the depths of that place. "Mark, go check the generator. There should be a control room nearby." Mark nodded and ran off, leaving Sarah and Harrison with the transforming creature. The process seemed to be speeding up now, the hose slowly splitting into fingers, the face reshaping itself into more human features. Suddenly, a siren began to sound throughout the lab. Red warning lights flashed in the corridors, and a computerized voice announced, "Attention, critical systems failure. Containment protocol compromised. Initiating self-destruct sequence in 10 minutes. "No," shouted Harrison. "The lab has a final safety system. If it detects total failure, it will incinerate everything to prevent contamination." Mike came running back. "The generator is dead. I found the control panel, but it's all in code." Harrison looked at the creature, then at his companions. "Go," he said. "I'll stay with Reynolds. I could try to cancel the sequence. I know the codes." "We're not leaving you," Sarah protested. A guttural sound came from the creature, now more man than monster. "Go," said a hoarse, distorted voice. It was the first clearly human word they had heard from it. Harrison took the documents from Sarah's bag. "Take these. Tell the world what happened here. But now run." Sarah hesitated for a moment, but Mark pulled her by the arm. Together, they ran through the dark corridors of the underground while the mechanical voice continued its countdown. They made it to the surface just as a violent tremor shook the building. Flames began to rise from the laboratory windows, and a series of controlled explosions began the systematic destruction of the complex. Sarah and Mark watched helplessly as the lab was consumed by fire. There was no sign of Harrison or Reynolds. The rain had stopped, and the sky was beginning to lighten on the horizon, heralding the dawn. "Do you think they?" began Sarah, but she couldn't finish the question. Mark put an arm around her shoulders. Harrison knew what he was doing. Maybe this was the only way to really put things right. In the days that followed, the authorities classified the incident as an industrial accident. The documents that Sarah and Mark saved were published anonymously, sparking heated debates about ethics in scientific research. The attacks in the Maryland forests ceased completely. Occasionally, on the darkest nights, some residents would swear they heard strange sounds coming from the forest. Not quite human, not quite animal. But now, these sounds sounded more like a mournful wail than a menacing roar. Sarah returned to her work in the library, but something had changed. Among the books on legends and folklore, she had set aside a special section to document the case of the Maryland hybrid, not as a monster, but as a warning about the dangers of playing with forces beyond our comprehension. And on stormy nights, when the wind howled through the trees, she wondered if somewhere in the depths of the forest, two men, a scientist in his creation, had finally found peace.